All right, we're in a new platform. Today, I'm going to wrap up something or other, like today, where it's not like I won't come for office hours. Really, I'll be here as much as people really want to participate. So I'll maybe try coming on once every 2 weeks, once a month, whatever. But if there's lots of people on asking questions, then I'll do whatever more. A lot of you I'll see, by the way, in 2 days at OMG Live, we have plenty of people coming, but we also have space. And so people want to still come. Love to have you there. There's a link in the OMG way and Mike's post that I think is either pinned or I messed up the pinning of it by pinning I don't know if I pinned my post or not, but I'll repin it. Anyway, it's obviously an OMG way. You can find the link. But anyway, I look forward, a lot of you already coming, virtually all of you probably on here. And I'll be right there the whole time. And I'm sure I'll have a lot of one-on-one discussions, group discussions with you guys and so forth. Today, we're going to talk, we can do Q&A. We can even have people on if someone wants to talk on a mic. But overall, will be probably, I have a few slides, but they're nothing major, just a little bit of overall framing. But I have lots of things to say. We're going to be talking about what amounts to a central idea I've always been trying to talk about and explain better and better to you guys since the beginning. You saw it on my post, which was that we're going to talk about what I'm calling finding the winning frame. Of course, I've said a lot of things similar to this in the past. A lot of this kind of capstone series and the kind of aftermath epilogue series with the office hours and stuff that we've done since then has been particularly driving a point home, really helping to make sure to explain things and bridge things well. And it's been astonishingly effective, it seems, where it's been very worthwhile. I just learned a lot of familiar stuff, but somehow said in a way that's really hitting people and being put into action and setting paradigms in place and all that stuff. Oh, best wishes to your mom, Julie. Sure, a number of us can pray for her. I had a whole series that I called Frames and Dimensionality before this one. And I talked about winning before you attack. I'll probably shed even more light on that today. I've talked most recently in the last few webinars or a couple of webinars about finding the yes frame. This is similar, but again, it's been the case that it's been hitting people in a new way when I kind of attack things in a way where I really try to bridge it over and make you feel it and really understand it and apply it. So that's what I'm doing here today with kind of, as I said, like really a very central idea. Let me take a look at the main slide here. So the or kind of essential distinction here of what I'm talking about, or to start framing what I'm talking about, is I wrote here on this slide, finding the winning frame. And this is all part of doing it right. This before the verses here. Finding the winning frame and letting the winning recipe follow. Versus starting with recipe. I didn't say starting with the recipe on purpose. Of course, if you get lucky and all your context and preparation and framing and assumptions and everything just happen to be right without you putting any thought into it. And if you happen, and therefore, if you also get the right recipe for success in a particular area, right? The right thing to say to a person to get them to do something, the right way to make money, whatever it might be, then of course you'll hit your target. But all of us pretty much have like mixed results in life, right? With succeeding. And then we want more and more to reliably get what we want, obviously succeed, get the results we want again with people, with relationships, business, figuring out ideas for ourselves or being happy, making money, etc. Sorry for a few more minutes. I might be randomly clearing my thought and coughing, but it should go away. Let's see here. Sometimes when I drink something cold, I end up doing that. What I envision for success on this webinar for you is what I envision it looking like. It's not so much about agreeing or seeing, oh, okay, the winning frame. Got it, David. It's more that what I want you to do is be able to recognize when you're accidentally doing it wrong, right? And it's likely, even if you've been working with me for a while, it's likely that it's fairly common that you're going to approach things the wrong way even still. And if you can spot that and know the distinction and know how to do it or how to start doing it right when you spot it, then you're obviously going to keep on developing the habit of doing things in the right order and the right way and the right framing and so forth. One interesting example of this is with the definition of words that I've started to refer to about objects and what words refer to. And pretty universally, when someone's like thinking, well, what is such and such? What is love? But it's not just if you feel like particularly deep and philosophical. Even if you're asking like, what is the best creative for this Facebook ad? right? Or what is the thing that I should say to this person? Or what can I do to get them to do such and such? That still is metaphorical to what I'm talking about, where you're looking to see like an object, but it's not like exactly a physical object. It might be a bunch of words that you say, a script, or a number of actions that you take, or again, like a graphic or creative or a headline or something like that. So you're thinking like, what headline should I use? But going back to the idea of words, if someone's asking like, what is love, or what do I want in a person that I joint venture with, or a customer or whatever, then people start trying to do something that's parallel to what I'm talking about and wrong, like in the reverse. They do the wrong side of this verses here in this slide. They start with the recipe. That's what I'm saying. In the past, I've said something that's fairly similar regarding starting with a center or the content, or like what's in the middle rather than content. But I think I'm honing in on explaining it even more effectively here. So it's not like that was better and you should think about what I said then, but it all really, okay. So what we try to do is we might like brainstorm or do something analogous to brainstorm, or think about what creative we want, or what headline we want, or what response feels right or comes to mind first to somebody to get them to do what we want. Or we might just respond without thinking, so to speak, right? But then, and then then they behave in the way that they behave after we respond in a somewhat unthinking way, or kind of, we feel like we're maybe a little bit thinking, but we obviously didn't think too much about it. We just did what we felt in the moment. But again, this relates to what I was saying about words, where when you're trying to see what something means, or when I said, what does it mean to find the yes frame? Or what does it mean about finding the winning frame? What do you mean by that, David? Could you give me an example of finding the winning frame? So that question itself, could you give me an example of finding the winning frame? Could you describe it? Could you give the characteristic of a winning frame? How do I know when I see the winning frame? All of those questions are actually have an element of doing the wrong thing that I'm exactly talking about here. They come so naturally to us, right? Well, could you describe the characteristic, right? Could you define it? We're trying to look directly at it and say what it is. We're trying to think what headline makes sense. So we start thinking of what has worked in the past. Maybe I reword it or apply it to this, or what comes to mind, or we ask someone else, or whatever. We see another headline that we like. So we're trying to directly find the recipe. We're trying to find the headline. We're trying to find the characteristic. We're trying to see what it looks like. We're trying to make the creative ad. We're trying to think about who our ideal client is. In all of those cases, we're actually doing the wrong thing in a certain way. We're starting with the recipe. We're trying to see what the answer is in a direct way, instead of what we're going to want to do, which I'm getting to describing directly. But again, the exact way to do it is not to try to describe it directly first. Right? But the words I'm using for it are finding the winning frame. And the more we understand this, the more we do it, then everything is just more effective, easy. It's directly correlated with getting the results that you want in a reliable way, in an efficient way, an effective way, and so forth. And the more you feel how counterintuitive it is today, the more we're probably communicating, the more I'm probably getting this across to you and in your mind and integrated in a helpful way. So this is really about seeing why we don't want to do things wrong and how to notice that happening while we're doing things wrong. We can't, for starters, we can't recognize the right recipe. We can't recognize the right headline. We can't recognize the right GD partner, the right plan, the right set of expectations for how many sales we're going to make in the next month or the next year, right? Our projections and all that stuff, right? When people make projections, they come up with expectations as a starting point. That's how they'll start their plan. And they'll never really leave because once you start with the recipe, then what do? You basically come up with plan A. You are now trying to prove that without totally realizing it, that your frame, your assumption, your existing awesomeness, in addition, right? That's part of your assumptions is how awesome you are, right? So you're starting a JV with someone. You're like, all right, here's generally how our marketing plan is going to be. And here's what our product is. And here's how many sales hope to make, or we think we can make. Here's our projections for the year, right? That's all recipe. That's all doing it wrong, but it's normal, right? And then what's going to happen after that? After that, you're going to go take action, right? Get started. You're going to work your plan, right? You plan your work by starting with a recipe. And then you work your plan like they tell you. right? You think big and you do all the things. You think positive and you have a growth mindset. And you're ready to be perseverant. And what happens is you never really looked at your assumptions very much in your frame. Now, you might have done a little bit of that. You might feel really brilliant and smart because you broke out of one of your assumptions. You realized it. You thought laterally, you thought outside of a particular box. And I've talked about this in the past, right? What happens? People think outside of a box, they end up in a different box. Maybe it's slightly wider and larger and more productive than the previous box, but then they stop there and then they do the exact wrong thing at that point with a little bit of extra arrogance, a little bit of extra patting themselves in the back. And what they did really was better than not thinking outside of their tiny box that got into a bigger box. That bigger box, let's say, it's actually better, right? They're thinking a little bit smarter, a little bit better. They thought about doing this JV project. They planned their business and they realized, wait a second, we're looking at it this way and that wasn't right. And we're going to look at it this way and that's better. And let's say they were right about that. So they did that right. But now they default back to the same old incorrect way of doing things. And so they're still like, they help themselves by doing something a little bit right, getting outside of a kind of too constricting or box or figuring out a wrong assumption and doing things right. But now they're done getting the benefit of that way of doing it. They did it once, but now that's enough, right? They don't want to overthink things, overplan, blah, 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 have analysis paralysis or whatever. And they don't want to be negative. They don't want to look negative to their partner, to their new JV partner or their partner they worked with once and been successful with. And now they're doing another thing. They want to look strong and confident, right? People don't want people who sound negative and question assumptions too much. And it just sounds negative, right? So now we're working with someone else. We have extra pressure not to do that. We want to sound confident. And then we want to prove that we're competent, right? Who works with a JV partner and they're on a project and they want to look incompetent? Not me, none of it, right? None of it. However, it's not that I'm advising you to look incompetent, but what we want to do is see how this whole way of doing things that by default is very wrong. So looking competent is not the problem. Of course, it's helpful to look competent rather than not to look competent, unless you're actually walking off a cliff, in which case you'd rather someone else or yourself notice that you're actually walking off a cliff and let you know. Probably don't want to look like you're not going to fall on your face and whatever. If you actually are, you'd probably probably rather someone spot it, maybe rather you spotted it yourself. Anyway, so that kind of thing can happen. But anyhow, you're going to be following your plan, right? Your business plan, working hard to do your part to help meet expectations and projections. And so what are you doing with your overall frame and assumptions and your own awesome? You're trying to prove that it already exists, right? You're trying to prove that you're already right. You're already good at what you promised you'd do. You're already a good JV partner, right? And someone might say to me, isn't it better to be a good JV partner? Yeah, of course. But what's going to make somebody be great or excellent or master anything? Is it by assuming that they already have the right frame and preparation and context and assumptions and framework and all that, and then trying to prove that, which of course means that whenever something is wrong with your frame, you have to be arrogant and defensive and compensate for it in all kinds of ways, right? That are, of course, by logic counterproductive, since I just said I'm stipulating there's a flaw in the frame, right? So anything that just covers it up is going to be counterproductive, right? For the most part, in the short term, it might be productive to not have someone else spot something, but then all the more reason why you would want to spot it yourself, right? If there's problems with your own frame, then sure, we might not want other people to see those problems. That might have some sort of backlash. But the very way for people to not see problems in your frame is for you to not drink your own Kool-Aid, at least, right? So you don't want to do this, right? Publicly, you can put on whatever face you need to, right? But for you yourself privately, you don't want to be doing things wrong. Publicly, you probably want to be a mix of appearing competent, but also appearing flexible and humble and changeable. And like people can come to you and talk to you about stuff or mention something if they think that you're wrong. That goes to also being strong yet flexible. The more you have clarity on what you really know, then the more you can be strong about that and get your strength there and that comes from the more clarity you have about your frames and assumptions and so forth. Then that allows you to be strong and come across as confident, much like I gave the metaphor of a parent, right? Or the illustration of a parent. With a child, the more you figure out real boundaries that you're necessarily going to want and need to uphold with your child, the more you can look confident while being very flexible within those boundaries, right? Same thing with working with a JV partner in business. The more you accurately know yourself, so to speak, the more you know correct overall frames in life. There's all sorts of things. We've talked about a bazillion of them in our various webinars of things you can know and that are helpful frames. Even just something like understanding the frame of working with people and dealing with people and relating to people with being respectful, aggressive, like I talked about in alchemy. The more you understand that correct frame, then the more kind of confident you can be in that, in your clarity and understanding of that. And then you can be flexible in whatever you're not clear on, right? And that will end up coming across as a great personality, right? You come across in a certain way, confident, have a strong, solid core, but yet people feel like they can talk to you honestly, when they have an issue, if there's one or a mistake or whatever, discuss something with you where they think you're wrong. Maybe they'll end up being wrong, but you can show them how. Maybe you'll be wrong, whatever, right? We're just trying to get right. So when you start with this recipe, like in an illustration here with a JV, you have your expectations, your plan. If the various frames aren't, some of those frames, a frame is a composite. It's not like a composite can be one thing in the sense that a car consists of a whole bunch of parts, right? So in that way, it's a composite. It has a carburetor, wheels, steering wheel. On the other hand, it's also one thing, a car, right? And both of those are reasonable ways of looking at a car as one thing or as a composite. Same thing with your frame that you take into a business venture. It's one composite thing that consists of your overall understanding of success, your overall understanding of morality, including not having a whole bunch of kind of garbage morality that gets in the way, like that you have to spend Thanksgiving with your family or something like that is something that some people feel as a moral imperative, right? It might be a good strategic choice to do, but it may not. And you don't want to, it's not really a moral choice. It's more of a strategic choice, right? Whether to spend Thanksgiving with your family, if that makes sense. So people have all sorts of extra sort of morality that they might have that kind of gets in the way. Then they might also have immorality when it comes to violating contracts and agreements and not respecting people's time, right? And so for example, having that in place, right? Being very clear and specific and good with money, especially, right? Is a terrifically good way to operate, and it's shockingly rare. Right? And very common, and online entrepreneurs are a little bit casual, right? Part of what we want to do is work for ourselves, be a one-man gang to some degree. We both want to work with people and we want to be on our own, right? Nice little balance or whatever you call it. For the most part, I'm not trying to tell you how to be, but I think most of us want both of those things, right? In a way that makes, but that often goes along with being cavalier about, there's not really a good plan about keeping track of and paying money and what exactly is an expense that's a shared expense and all that, right? One of the things I did for OMG was get that very right, including like really everyone felt it and bought into it, like our plan, and did the accounting part of it and the paying out part of it. And had been very meticulous about it. So I'm explaining what I mean by frame, right? So it's a composite of your work ethic, your various mindsets. We could call it your psyche as like your climate and your mindset, particular day or moment, or like the weather, whatever, right? Like the various elements of your psyche and where your mindset come from. Various ways you look at abundance, various ways you look at integrity, your various competencies and or incompetencies or estimations or misestimations of your knowledge, strength, whether you can rank a website, how you feel about whether you can rank a website, whether you actually can, whether you actually will. All of these are like part of what I mean by your frame, right? So again, it's made of parts like a car, and then it's also one thing overall. Right? That kind of forms a composite person with respect to how you are as a JV partner. And there's a frame, right? And then there's you as a JV partner. Then there's the business, right? Overall, as you're planning it, there's your other partner. Then there's a composite, right? In terms of the business plan, the elements of the frame for your business. I've given you 3 places to look to help to get clarity on and design your frame for a business plan, which I've talked about: product, traffic, conversion. I gave a separate scheme that was very similar with different words and a little bit different explanation, where I talked about relationships instead of traffic, and decision instead of sales, and fulfillment instead of a product or service. But it'll all get you to the same place. And hearing my various discussions on that, they'll all probably add and help. So you can examine the elements of your frame regarding your plan with your product, your service, your traffic, sorry, product, service, traffic, sales. Okay. So let's try to go over and I'll start to talk about the left side, the correct side, so to speak, of this slide, where I said finding the winning frame and letting the winning recipe follow. This is going to iterate like a hologram. Or if you look at if you have two mirrors facing each other and you're looking in and you're like an infinite reflection or whatever. So this process just will iterate on a large scale, small scale, and it applies to itself and so forth. What I mean by that is that in order to understand this concept itself, instead of asking, well, what's the winning frame? What's an example of a winning frame? What we want to be able to do is start to recognize when we don't have a winning frame. And that when you can recognize that, then you see what the winning frame might be because you recognize you don't have it. But actually, the way that you seek it is something I've referred to in various ways over the years. But you are essentially crossing off what doesn't work, making distinctions and so forth. It's possible, depending on on the circumstance, the situation, you may be able to be sure that you have a particular winning frame for some reason. That would happen when when you can, if you show that the opposite of something, mostly what you're going to have is element of your frame that you can be certain of. For example, when it comes to sales, you can be sure that confusing your audience is going to be a bad idea, right? I guess someone could somehow come up with an exception to that in some way, shape, or form, but there's a certain overall truth to that you can be sure, right? If you write a sales letter that ends up just being confusing and people don't really quite know what you're talking about, or you're on a webinar and you're trying to sell something, or you're just talking to someone one-on-one in whatever way, including trying to remember a lot of what's parallel to sales is you're working on a project with someone and you're trying to, even if you don't realize it, you're in essence looking to have them be motivated to do their part, right? And just to be clear, right, about their part of that, them understanding what you're actually saying, what you mean to do, what you mean for them to do, what the timeline might, if they end up confused, whether or not they realize it, whether or not you realize it, then the sale in the sense of them completing the project or the part of the project you want isn't going to happen, right? Or it's much less likely or probably just not going to happen. Confusion is probably in one sense, the easiest, kind of like the biggest bang for the buck that a lot of people will get in terms of sales is going over their sales presentation to eliminate confusion and understanding how to do that better and better. And just basically being clear is going to get you way farther than you might ever imagine when it comes to sales. Obviously, you need to have something that people want to some certain degree, but if you do have something that people want, including that there's a reason why they want it from you, right? Then if you're just clear about that, then, you're going to make some decent amount of sales in most industries, most cases. Anyway, I gave that thing about clarity and confusion as an example of a part of a frame that you can be quite certain of. Let me put it this way. You're finding the frame, you're finding the recipe. The frame and the recipe kind of seamlessly blend together. There's not really fundamental difference between a frame and a recipe. And what I mean by that is your specific wording of your sales letter, is that a recipe or a frame? It's certainly a detail in one sense, right? But it becomes something that you're standing on and relying on once you write it. What you're really doing is you're narrowing down your frame, you're expanding your framework, right? It's like with learning, right? What's framework and what details, right? Because the new details or the details as they get assimilated and integrated to some core of some beginning part of understanding where it kind of coalesces, right? That you're going to need when you're learning something. But then a framework builds and details, as you accumulate details, those enable you to understand new details and ask new questions and get additional answers, and your whole amount of learning and framework, which include then details for a particular subject or topic, grows, right? Regarding your understanding of a JD partner, what parts of your understanding of their personality, of your experience with them is a detail, a recipe, what's a part of your framework for understanding them? It all blends together, right? I use the words frame and recipe rather than not having two words because it refers to a little bit to like where at the extreme ends, they begin in two different places, right? Like your frame begins at your kind of your foundation, right? Your like outermost frames. It works inward from there, and details begin at the most surface level and but they grow together, right? Or blend together. ultimately. You don't, that probably made a reasonable amount of sense, but to the extent that it didn't, all right, for now, it's not really even critical to worry over much about. It's almost like my message there is you don't have to worry over much about recipe and frame start to grow together as details and framework start to blend together. That's totally fine. Don't worry about that. That's just how it is. You probably got it, but one last quick thing. If you're like weaving a quilt, then, how much of it is outline and frame and how much of it is individual details of the design on the quilt or individual threads, whatever, right? They call blend together. What do? You kind of, I don't know exactly, but in one sense, you build it in, you're just always building it until it's all built, but you have to build it from you have to start from some anchor point, right? And build in some way that maintains that anchor point and grows outward in some way, right? No matter what you're building. All right. So the way it's going to look if you are, I started to talk about what was normal, but what I was asserting was wrong regarding making a business plan with a partner and then how it would progress from there. We're trying to prove that you're already competent and your assumptions are right and that your business plan A is going to work, right? I've talked in the past about when you make a plan, you don't want to make a plan A and then your plan is for plan A to work, right? My plan is always of a different structure, which is fairly weirdly simple, but oddly not done a lot, which is my plan involves, here's what happens if plan A works and here's what happens if plan A doesn't, right? So my plans always look like that. That's obvious after I say it, but if you look at people actually planning and acting, they don't actually plan and act that way typically. They plan as if plan A is going to work. They think that it's negative or it will jinx it or something if they have a sense of what they'll do if it doesn't work. And you don't need to have a full action plan if plan A doesn't work. You just need to have thought through it, kind of like the analogous to thinking through that moment that you're afraid, right? That I talked about in my fear video that you're afraid of. And you keep, what do we do if it doesn't work? And it doesn't have to be you plan every detail of what if it doesn't work, but you generally will reassess at that point, or you might have a bit of a sense of approximately what you'll do. There might be some details or some steps, but you don't need to go too far into it unless for some reason it's going to matter. If you're going to be in a rush, right? If it's going to be very timely, if there's any reasonable possibility of plan A not working, and again, if you're going to be particularly rushed afterwards, then you should plan out a bunch of details for what to do otherwise, a rainy day plan or whatever. And of course, if for some reason you're still going to be rushed and there's a good chance that plan B won't work, then you want to keep on planning until you get through where there's going to be an urgent rush and you have something that one way or the other is going to work, right? Including at some point you get rid of the rush itself, right? Somehow. In a lot of cases though, the only real rush is in a sense of panic or urgency, not in a sense of adrenaline rush. But with a lot of plans and business plans that they go, there often isn't really much of a rush, but what there is an urgency because people's mindset will break down, right? They'll go to pieces to some degree. I've seen this. It always seems like there's no way people would be this basically stupid, right? But it's like it happens greater than 90% of the time that things don't work out just as people expect and hope. And then they go to pieces and they really get dejected and they don't know what to do. So the urgency is more like that you want to plan ahead so that people don't just go psychologically to pieces and basically give up, or at least have to spend a day being cajoled and massaged and comforted and pep talked and all that kind of stuff, right? That's what happens a lot. But it's bizarrely common. Like, again, it's basically predictably almost certain. Obviously, I've had a tremendous amount of success. And yet, in nearly every time that I'm working with somebody, there's a point where they just feel like it's failure and they're dejected, have to be talked off the cliff and down from the ledge or whatever. I guess not off the cliff, but down from the ledge at the right way, put off the sage side of the cliff, not off the wrong side of the cliff. Although it might be tempting to try to come up the wrong side and just move on. All right. So surprisingly enough, what we want to do is it is valid and useful and important to ask something like, what would a win look like? And we want to have a good sense. So we will do that. That is not starting. That's not a recipe. Okay. We could call it a vision, but whatever it is, it's something that's going to be solid and correct if you do it right. Okay. So What we are going to do is ask what a win looks like, but that's different than having a recipe for it. There's a difference between asking what the right headline is or what the right graphic or creative is for a Facebook ad. That's the recipe. Versus asking what would it look like if we got that right? If we won, what would a win look like regarding a Facebook ad creative? So that's a correct question. That is not going to give us our whole winning frame, but it's the right starting question. What would the win look like? What would the world look like after we won? What would a win look like after I figured out what to say and what my tone should be and what my overall communication should be with a partner? I don't know what that is yet. I don't know the recipe for that to start with, but what would their behavior and or their feelings and so forth look like and feel like if I did that successfully, if I won, right? And I don't mean beat them. Of course, it presumably would be a win-win, right? In most everything in life, right? We want it to be a win-win, ideally, win, et cetera, right? Everyone wins. But what would that look like? If you are doing a JV project, right? A business basically, but it doesn't have to be like a full blown business, whatever it is, like a JV project, right? Where it's going to result in, let's say, making some money, right? If you're making a particular website with someone where you rank it and they work on the conversion or the product on it, whatever, right? Whatever a JV project might, they're promoting you and they want to make money and you of course want to make money and make them one, whatever it is. So as a JV project, you ask yourself, it's great if you collaboratively manage to do this with someone else, but you can't depend on someone else to understand what I'm talking about in this weather. So at least you want to understand this for yourself. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to impose this on someone else, but if you do this for yourself, then you are going to be in good shape in life. So again, I'm not conflating. I'm not saying it's the exact same thing that you need to force the other person to collaborate with you on. You could certainly, by example, encourage and lead them to do it. And how do you lead someone? You generally taste them first. You listen to them. You get a sense from them of where they're at, what they're thinking of, right? But you could almost walk somebody to this without them even realizing it, and they'll like it. But so instead of asking what the plan is, what the expectations are, what the projection is, what the and all that stuff, what are the action steps? Instead, you start with the following, and you're still not going to do action steps next. Exactly. But so that's not even going to be step two, right? What people normally do is step one. It's going to be no step. It's actually going to fill itself in. We're going to do a photo negative of it. We're going to fill in if you picture a silhouette, we're going to make the silhouette of what we want by figuring out the area around the silhouette. If you had a letter F, right? This letter F is shown positively, but we could also make the letter F by coloring in. I don't know if the option to do that is on this, and I don't want to mess with this too much right now, but there's some font option to make it so that there's like black all around the letter F, right? And then the letter F is white, right? And so we filled in everything around it. And in doing so, the letter F reveals itself, right? That's a better representation of what we're going to overall be looking to do in order to find the winning frame, let the recipe follow, and then we'll know elements of the winning frame. Sometimes we'll figure out like some components of what we're doing we might know are correct because the opposite has to be. But our plan, our frame, our actions, the exact words we say on a sales page, for example, we're probably never going to know that they're the perfect words, right? That's an example of something that you're using as part of your framework, but you don't know for sure, right? There might be parts or aspects or meta strategies about sales and sales letter writing that you can know are correct. You're not going to know the exact wording is perfect. So again, there's going to be a mixture of things for sure and things that you're doing your best with, eyeballing the best you can. But what's probably going to happen is you're just going to eventually win, which means you're going to get over the bar. You're going to make enough money. You're going to have a successful project, whatever over the bar means. I'm skipping around a little bit here. I'm going to get back to the order of doing things with starting by what the win looked like. In a moment, I'll jump back to that. But you'll achieve that win that you start at step one. You figured out what a win would look like. At some point, you'll be doing your process, you'll be filling in your framework, and bam, you'll win. You'll hit that situation, that after of the before and after. The world will already look like it would look like after you won, right? So you never even knew that you had the winning frame, for sure. You might have known you had aspects of it, right? And you might have felt more and more confident. You may or may not, or you might not have. It might sneak up on you, or it might be obviously coming. It happens different ways in different situations, right? But it sneaks up on me plenty, right? I think that if I'm far from the win and blam out, I win, right? Other times I think I'm close, I was wrong, right? But in a certain way of looking at it, I always win, right? In a practical, mundane, simplistic, simple, not even simplistic, but simple way, I win very regularly, right? Like my wins in life are fairly obvious and extremely consistent. If someone could argue that I didn't win here, win there, I would say I'm still working on those, or that kind of, right? So there's either things I'm working on or I've already won, but that's not just like an overall vacuous thing. There's a reason why you guys are listing me and not versus not, right? Is that my actual track record in real life, that there's plenty of real actual wins that happen pretty fast, right? And accumulate. This isn't just, oh, eventually over millions of years, you'll hit a win, right? It's not only that at all. This is the most efficient process. This is the fastest way, the straightest distance between 2 points that I'm giving you. But sometimes that's not going to happen instantly. Sometimes it might come across like you're just being kind of naively positive or something like, well, eventually I'll succeed. Right. But again, this is always the shortest distance. The only reason why you would do things wrong and just leap into, I'm actually going to stop myself, but I have something useful to say. I'll say it in a minute. That'll clear up the kind of somewhat obvious question of how do I know when to take action? Or isn't there some point, David, where we make a business plan and work on it? Yeah, I'll absolutely. In a sense, there's a way to understand where you get all the obvious, obviously you have to do something like, but I'll make sure to make that clear in a moment. First, let me skip back to talk about what the win looks like. And then I will talk about how do you actually end up making a business plan? Do you never do it? What are you saying here, David? So I'll address that next. All right. So step one is what does it look like after you've won, right? So if it's a business plan, what might that look like? It doesn't need to look like we have all the money we need forever and it's all part of it's invested in annuities and like my house and my Rolls Royce and whatever, 2.5 kids and a white picket fence and all that. You don't need that for a business project, right? That might be a useful overall frame that helps you, that narrows things down for you, right? All the frames that you have that are more foundational, more outer, they're automatically working for you all the time. They're like these awesome employees that you don't have to pay and they're always working, right? Or advisors that are always right, however you think of them, or just frames that are solid to stand on, floors that are powerful to stand on, helping you. Whatever it is, the more true, correct, clear, understood frames you have, or components of your overall frame that you have, the better, right? So the more you have an overall sense of money and what a win looks like with that, great. But I've talked about that, so I'll talk about this as a different example rather than just repeating that one. In the case of a business project, it might look like, okay, we have a website, it's up, it's getting what's obviously a nice amount of organic traffic, and it's making us a profit that we can see is pretty nice, right? If you want, you can come up with an exact number of what it might be beneath which it really wouldn't be a success, right? Or beneath which you wouldn't have won yet, right? Obviously, you don't ever set a goal or a plan where I either hit it or I go to pieces. And yet people do that nonstop, right? By accident. That's why they go to pieces nonstop, right? And then when people are doing business, right, they spend a good amount of time feeling disappointed in their result, right? And there's a resulting inefficiency that I spent a lot of hours dealing in all kinds of ways, personally, at least. I might be maybe in what I do in my particular niche, in my particular role, maybe I deal with it a lot more than other people, but still it definitely happens like nuts, right? So you're not making like a number beneath which if you don't hit it, you just feel dejected and unhappy, right? What you can do is say that here's what it looks like if it's a success. And if at a certain point that looks roughly like we spent this much time and given it this much time and that's not happening, then here's what we do. We shake hands and try with different people. We try it, or we try together with another website, or we reassess from there, right? It can be as simple as this. After 6 months of doing this, if we haven't hit where it's bringing in $5,000 a month, where we feel like the organic traffic is, or whatever, is enough to support that, some that might like already incorporate that it obviously has enough traffic, then we'll reassess. based on our experience working together, if we want to continue working together or not. We might really still want to work together. We might really feel like there's stuff we can do together, but this particular project isn't right, et cetera. And it might be that a week from now, we start working on this and we change our whole plan, right? For good reason, whatever that is, right? But it's always true that at any time you can change your plan as long as the change consists of comparing it with a clarity on the existing plan. And when you eyeball it, the difference is easy to see. Like one, and the new plan is clearly better, right? Not that it definitely will work and the other one definitely won't, but just that like your estimation, it's pretty clear. If you're estimating the success of one plan versus the other, it's pretty clear when you look at it that, you're confident that there's going to be more chance of success with the other. If you don't feel that way, then stick with plan A. Think about it. That's the point of plan A. It's inefficient to go to plan B ever if when you eyeball the difference, it's not clearly plan B is better. Because there's an inherent, it's like an employee or a partner, right? If you're married to someone, if the alternative isn't clearly better than staying married to them, then the cost of divorce is high, right? The cost of getting rid of an employee or starting with a whole new JV partner exists, right? And so if you can't tell the difference between plan B and plan A, then why would you pay the cost of transitioning? And yet in practice, again, people do make that mistake frequently. The main way, however, that people change to plan B is by just not having clarity, including remembering that there is a plan A and what it is. Like somehow a week or two later, people have amnesia that there is a plan, what the plan is. They might just remember like a few broad details and totally otherwise change the plan, right? And that is really counterproductive, very counterproductive. It's another very common thing that happens. Super easy to have happen, even though it sounds dumb and almost impossibly dumb when I put it this way. It's very common. So you definitely do want to be clear on a plan A, whatever that might be. That plan A might be just a very bare bones structure. All right, I'm going to work on ranking the site. You work on getting the product for the site and a kind of a way to sell the product. Like you work on product to conversion. I'll work on, this is all hypothetical, right? When I say this, of course you can, joint ventures can be any number of a zillion things. But again, the overall structure could be that simple. I'll get working on ranking it. You get working on getting the product together and the sales process, right? That might be a totally valid plan A structure. You actually might not need more clarity because it might just be, and then we'll meet in 2 weeks and we'll update each other, right? That might be a fully valid plan A. But remember, I'm not saying you start with plan A. You start with what does a win look like? But slightly skipping around, but this all helps fill in the whole picture. So I was trying to say I was trying to fill in explain what the idea of what it looks like in practice to figure out what a win looks like. So a win might look like we're making this much money in 6 months, right? That's different. Now, the reason I started getting into what does plan A look like and so forth, what we're obviously going to need to do here is be careful and be able to distinguish between setting projections, between basically setting a plan. I started meandering into that, and then I started meandering into explaining how to do it right. But looking back, that was basically a little bit confusing. So let me clear up the confusion. A good way to characterize what a win looks like is you feel happy with the money that the website bringing in, and you feel happy with the way that you work with your partner, or you've gained clarity. So in one sense, you can leave it at there because you're not setting a plan or an expectation. You're doing something very different. So if you accidentally meander into encoding it or labeling it or feeling it as a plan, that's a bad plan. Like the idea of feeling like, you might even get this, but I've said over and over that of course your plan is not to win. Your plan is your route, which should also be a route that covers all bases, right? In order to win. So you don't want to confuse the two. You can identify what a win looks like, but that doesn't have to be, it may not come to pass, right? What will come to pass, if that win doesn't come to pass, then you'll be working on something, right? This isn't really necessarily complicated anyway. Let me go forward and then we'll see if it clears itself up. So let's suppose the other person is just cooperating with you. You're talking to them just for the sake of illustrating. So you say, all right, you're talking to them and you say, what does a win look like? And you both agree that a win would look like one person has done a good job getting the product together and the sales funnel process. And the other person's done a good job getting qualified traffic to the site, which means that money's coming in and you guys feel good about it. So you almost want to keep it almost as vague as possible while identifying the high point, like the point that with the win. Okay. So that's the win. Once you realize what I mean by what does a win look like, once we figure that out, then it's super not complicated, right? What's complicated in a sense is distinguishing it verbally and also psychologically and so forth from expectations or planning. Look, I'll continue to go forward here. So you figure out that's what a win would look like, right? Regarding any kind of semi-soft lock type of win like that, potentially it might be, that might be harder to achieve than a really qualified as a semi-soft lock. But one way or the other, regarding a kind of proposed win, that particular win might not happen, right? But by operating in the way that we're talking about, you're going to get something the same or better with the same or better person. In terms of a JV with you, I don't mean that they're overall in general a better or worse person. In terms of a match for you as a JV partner in this example. Okay. Or you're going to find a same or better win regarding money overall, right? As I said, this kind of iterates like two mirrors facing each other, where overall you might be able to be clear in a clearly correct way on what an overall win with money looks like. Something like you don't have to prioritize money, which if you have to prioritize money, then if you think logically, here's the proof of why that's a useful win, right? If you do, the opposite of that would be you do have to prioritize money, right? There's only two options. You either have to prioritize money or you do not have to prioritize money. Those are exact opposites. Exactly one of those states is going to be true and exactly one of those is going to be false. The structure of logic, not determined by any person. That's just correct. So I could explain that even better, but I'm going to stop. Those are two opposites, right? You either money has to be a priority for you, must be a priority, or it does not have to be a priority. If it has to be a priority for you, then that means you can't otherwise choose your priority. That means everything else needs to not be a priority, at least during whatever chunk of time or chunk of mental focus, which includes like what your mind is working on while you're sleeping, right? What you're thinking about while your wife's talking to you. Maybe you're still working on a problem regarding money, right? So it's not just that you can even block off time necessarily for priorities that keep on imposing themselves on you sometimes, right? Or needing to be imposed. So it's clearly then suboptimal to not be able to choose your priorities otherwise, right? So having money imposed on you externally as a priority is pretty obviously not preferable. Maybe somebody could point out a flaw in what I'm saying. That's fine if they could. But in the absence of them doing that, my reasoning is fairly clear and simple there, right? So a win regarding money would mean, again, that money does not have to be a part of making money, like doing things to basically take in money, right, in your life. Don't have to be a part, which I think is pretty obviously preferable. That sort of win is important because priorities are one of the things that have the biggest impact on your life and your results and your happiness and all that. Right? You can fully, I've talked about this before, you can fully direct or mess up or improve somebody's life just by changing their priorities. So what your priorities are extraordinarily central and impactful to your life, to your impact on other people's lives and so forth. Therefore, if money's or anything, the need for companionship, sex, whatever, if that's imposing itself on you as a priority, then you want to deal with it, right? So that way it's not imposing itself and then you have more flexibility regarding priorities. While it truly is imposing itself, you don't want to deny reality. You want to acknowledge reality, say this is going to impose itself on me until and unless I deal with it in some way, right? And it's going to be, as far as I can tell, once again, logically, has to be some combination of the need that you have to spend money and or the amount taking in money, right? If you could get your spending down so down to zero, live in the wilderness or wherever, then that if truly money then was not a priority. If the need to live in the wilderness in and of itself wasn't messing with your priorities, right? Then, because if it was, then basically money would be sneaking in the back door, right? If you had to choose your priorities based on that, you couldn't do a whole bunch of things that otherwise would be priorities because you had to maintain your life in the wilderness. Then money is still running you, right? Running your priority, which means you can't choose them, which is worse. So with that sort of thing, it's obviously critically impactful, right? Because it affects your number one priorities. So you need to deal with it, and you need to deal with it until you win, until you get what you want. Regarding having a particular, I'm doing that. I explain that to draw a contrast. Regarding a specific joint venture with a JD, that is not as critically central. You don't have to make that work in the same way. It's certainly preferable to make it work because it's basically always more efficient to stick with plan A, right? And to succeed with plan A until unless clear plan B comes along. And then it becomes more efficient to switch if it's clear, right? You look at the cost of switching, you look at the benefit of switching, and if there's a clear difference, then you switch. And that's the only time you should switch, interestingly, which also then ends up proving that you want to have clarity on plan A. One of the things that really aids clarity is actually to keep things simple and bare bones, right? Which is another reason why starting with details, things that are not critical part, you don't start there. You let themselves fill themselves in. One of the ways that I explain law of implication overall is you start with what you know and you build from. This is just in one sense, an illustration of that, an application of it, another angle on the central thing that takes into account whatever. So you start by identifying the win. In some cases, you need to keep going until you achieve that win because it's so impactful. But even when it comes to money overall being a priority, that's like plan A is like, all right, I got to take care of this. And if my need for a relationship or a love relationship is overwhelming and taking over as priorities all the time, then I'll need to deal with that and have a win. It's still my overall scheme where that's plan A until plan B comes along that's clearly worth switching to. It's still true, right? If I'm bleeding on the floor, for example, from a knife wound, then time for plan B, right? Until I deal with that knife wound and then I can go back to worrying about my love relationship and money. But so all of this is coherent as I need to explain it and fill it in for you. It continually iterates where you have an overall plan A. There's more profound overall plan A's, like overall trying to deal with money in your life, overall trying to deal with a love relationship. If that's imposing itself on you, it may not on some people. Then there's ones where it's just basically more plausible, realistically, that a plan B might come along, right? Like having a particular JD project work for someone. It's the same flow. It's the same logic. You still stick with plan A until plan B comes along, but it's more plausible and more common that a particular JD project might not exactly end up with a win. Or in another way to put that though, you're not losing, you're just switching to plan B for a good reason, right? Out of clarity, not out of lack of clarity, not out of a mistake, but out of, again, clarity. You're switching to plan B. But the structure is the same. You have your plan A. So now let's talk about the difference between, I keep talking about plan A here, David. What about that versus, isn't that starting with a recipe? It'll be useful to stick within our overall example. We figure out regarding this JV that we would like a win would look like where we feel good about the money coming in and partners to that. The path to that is a little different, right? And the path might look like we were okay doing the work that we had to do. We were okay with how it seemed like our partner was acting, right? And so forth, whatever. But let me try to, okay, obviously there's an obvious question that I'm referring to here, which is, all right, David, what's the right way to do it? What's the wrong way to do it? I'm trying to think if I want to try to illustrate this in collaboration with your partner. Let's suppose that both partners are fans of LOI. They end up getting what I'm talking about here, regardless of whether I make any sense. They still figure it out and they're both ideally enlightened and doing it right. All right. So what it might look like is they say, all right, what they're going to do is they're going to identify frame element. They're also going to simply move forward. It's perfectly reasonable to make what looks very similar to the business plan that I poo-pooed, but with a different overall paradigm, which is that you're going to move forward, but in moving forward, assumptions and errors in your frame that are relevant, errors in various components of your frame. And again, they could be anywhere. They could be, you have assumptions about how often you should take vacations with your family, but they end up becoming a problem in your JV project. And then you need to, one way or the other, figure that out. Maybe your partner is too much of a workaholic, and that you identify that it makes more sense for them to chill out about worrying about your vacations. Or maybe your vacations are genuinely really the issue and you try to figure that out, right? But you see, what you do is you can make a certain type of business plan that looks fairly similar. But it's still, I'll try to identify some differences as well, but it can look fairly similar to other people's business plan. But first of all, you at least would know, okay, let's figure out our plan for the product, for conversion, and for traffic, right? Rather than just simply talking about how big the market is and how much of a share you want to get and how much you're going to spend on advertising, right? And so forth. But you're not taking action with the expectation that you're already awesome and that your various assumptions about each other. Even you're not even assuming that what seems like obviously the other person said to you about what they would do and what you clearly said to them about what you would do. You want to realize that you don't want to assume that actually took place. In other words, right, so you have a meeting with your partner, you say, I'm going to do exactly this, you're going to do that. And it seems obvious to you that they understood what you're talking about and that you understood what they were talking about and that you both had a meeting of the minds. That assumption that you guys actually did have a meeting of the minds and actually did communicate clearly and correctly and both got the same idea that you've each thought you did in your head, that is not necessarily the correct assumption. So the right way to go forward is you can make action steps. You can make what would otherwise be called a business plan. But the way that you're proceeding, either with your partner's involvement or just in a vacuum by yourself, but you do your best to compensate for this all on your own, which is what I do to some degree, like in my life with various partners. Less so with some partners, more so with others, et cetera, et cetera. And I also, I don't mean just me, I'm not talking about people. There's all sorts of people I work with that aren't obvious. They're not just like my official partners in OMG. So this whole scheme I'm talking about works completely relevant. It's completely relevant, actionable, regardless of the other person's, I say tongue in cheek, like regardless of their state of enlightenment. Of course, of course, the more your JV partner understands this and does this as well, the better off you are, because of course that goes to their overall competence, their overall meta strategy. Obviously, the better that is, the better you both, the better you both are off, the better off you both are. But that's just inherently true. But obviously, the better they are, whatever, right? The better they are at sales, the better you guys are off as well. But that doesn't mean that every person you work with that's going to do sales stuff on their end is going to be a perfect savant, right? Everyone's going to have various degrees of competence and all kinds of stuff that would be ideal if they were even more competent, including, of course, yourself and myself. And similarly, their degree of competence with law of application and this winning frame idea is going to vary, right? But like anything, their varying degree of competence is something that you work with, right? Including, again, your own, right? So obviously, we're not going into this perfect and everything, masters of everything. So you're coming up with action steps and following those action steps, but the purpose behind those action steps, of course, you're picking the action steps that you think by eyeballing are most likely to succeed, obviously. But your plan is not exactly that those are the right actions. Just if you write a sales letter, that might not be the perfect words. And for a lot of people, they test and they try different things, right? So your plan when you write a sales letter is to see what either the best sales letter is or what the best sales letter you can make is, of course, right? No one, in one sense, you're looking for the best sales letter, but in another sense, of course, you're looking for the best one that you can make, right? So that is done correctly to a greater or lesser degree by people, right? In terms of sales letters, right? You write a sales letter partly in order to write a better one, right? So your business plan, your action steps are in one sense made in order to find both a better recipe, but also really in order to find, in order to make a better framework. And you might say, which is it, David? I already said recipe and framework, they blend, they ultimately blend, they meet in the middle, right? They blend together seamlessly. So you're finding both, but you don't leave out the framework. And the more meta something is, often the more impactful it is anyway. Or another way to put it is the more kind of something is an immediate detail, it might be more impactful in the moment than realizing a more deep meta frame that's off. But probably the ripple effect and the overall over time effect or impact of figuring out a problem with that's something more meta. Like you're, again, you realize you had an assumption about spending family time where really it amounts to every time your spouse tells you that you need to stop working, you do. That can cause problems, right? I'm not trying to tell you where to draw the line or what's exactly right, but you can see that if it amounts to that. And then also, if you think that's how everyone is, problem is for a lot of the highest earners, the people and for a lot of other reasons, you're going to probably want a JV with, they might not think that way. And so you might think everyone thinks that way, right? You might have been raised that way. I know it might not be you. I'm giving this also as an example of the type of thing that can happen, right? For you, it might be something totally different than this, but I have to give something to. Anyway, so for you or for people that you work with, right, you might be on the opposite end, right, of this, in which case, by the way, it's helpful to not just assume that they're wrong and just dislike them for it and get in your own head and get all worked up. Instead, in a case where you're on the opposite side of this, where they've been raised and surrounded by people where they take it for granted that if their spouse tells them to do something that in a certain tone or a certain way of saying it or a certain type of thing that they're telling you to do, be home for dinner tonight or whatever, or stop working at this time or whatever they do, that they cater to that. That it's not exactly necessarily right or wrong. It's more about who you're going to match up with, right? There's benefits and drawbacks in different ways of thinking about it to matching up in either direction. For me, I found it much more preferable to not think and act exactly like that. Instead, I find ways to be proactive where I don't run into that. And I certainly don't advertise it. Some people, they're so used to thinking that everyone must think that way, where family comes first, that they publicize it. And it's the kind of thing, a little bit like with politics, right? If you publicize it, you need to be aware that everyone doesn't think. Like I know when I talk about something political, I don't think that everyone's going to like, right? I do it for other reasons. But what you don't want to do with publicizing the family thing or vice versa, right, is think that everyone's going to agree with you, that you're working with. When I'm talking on a webinar, it's different. I'm talking about the meta of it. I'm thinking about the topic. I'm talking about you're involved with a project and you talk as if, of course, you blow off your family on the one end, or of course, my wife is telling me I need to stop doing this, so I stop doing it. I see people doing it either way. And it's more something where you want a good match, or for other reasons, you're a great match with someone, you really want to work with someone, and they're on the opposite side of that issue with you. But for other reasons, you want to work with them still. And so do you want to be sitting there not accepting it, or do you want to find ways to incorporate it and work with it? Right, I've talked about this in the past. If you're going to work with someone, you're working with a package. Can you influence them in various directions? Sure. But you can come up with a whole separate additional win for yourself, which is, here's what it would look like if I totally changed that person's paradigm regarding their family coming first in certain ways. Maybe not first overall, but first after 7 p.m. or after 5 p.m. or whatever. Maybe I don't want it to quite be that way. A win would look like I've helped them see my point of view and they adopt an adjusted point of view. But that win might not be worked out to be the right plan A, right? You may or may not achieve that. As a rule of thumb, any plan that ends up happening in your mind, and this thing happens, whether you phrase it this way, this type of thing happens all the time, where you end up where, ooh, it would be a win if this person changed. And so anytime it involves another person changing, you need to be particularly open to that plan A not work, that particular win that you suppose. When I say I win consistently, I don't mean that I always change everyone's mind to be my drone or think just the way that I do about every detail at all. A lot of how I win consistently is I don't walk into what's going to be a loss, right, in a certain way. So actually, let me touch on that because it's all part of seeing this. I'm in one way, I filled in more and more about what a winning plan might look like. But what makes how you know that overall you don't have a winning frame, even if many components of it are right, something's wrong in your frame, right? You don't have a well functioning car if the carburetor is busted. If you say the steering wheel is awesome and the tires are great, if the carburetor is busted, the carburetor, right? So if you do not absolutely know, I'm about to say something very important here that you might wonder why. And I might wonder the same. But if you don't know for sure that you're going to win, then you don't have a winning frame. Yeah. You might by luck have everything right. But if you don't, part of having a winning frame, we could say, is being clear that you do have a winning frame. So even if you luckily have it, if you don't have clarity on it, then there's an issue. And practically speaking, this ends up being very practical. This isn't like some philosophical point that I'm making. What happens is the way, here's how it works. It's pretty nice. You imagine what a win might look like. Then you see if you're absolutely certain. Certain isn't even great because now you're checking your feelings. But if you can get logically certain that you're going to achieve it, then great. If not, then what you do is you start doing thoughts and acting in order to get more certain of the frame, right? This is just another way of putting what I've said in a million different ways, is you either have the framework for sure or you build it. And you build the framework. Do you start outside in? What happens again? What are you going to see? You're going to see wrongness. You're going to see that you don't know what to do. You aren't sure, right? And so you don't know how deep that wrongness goes. You don't know, oh, is it a problem with like my overall meta view of life? Is it an issue with my attitude? Is it an issue with my assumption I'm making about the other person, or about maybe my paradigm about communicating with other people as an issue? But my overall paradigm about God and purpose in life is right. But I don't quite get how it works with communicating with other people. Right. But again, you don't quite know where the problem is. You just know there's a problem. You don't necessarily know where to look. You just know that you need to look. Right. But on the other hand, the problem might fairly obvious. Like what you can do is, if it looks like it's a problem with your frame, some component of your frame about communication, then look there. You don't. And then if you think you got it right, or if you're looking there and something's wrong still, then, or if maybe you get that right, maybe you work on it until it seems like you got it right, or you keep working on it, you just can't get it right. Maybe if you can't get it right, maybe there's a deeper problem. If you can get it right, then there might not be a deeper problem and you just got it right, like with your communication issue. Take with politics, if you just try not to hate, right? They say that hating is the problem, incivility is the problem. But you keep trying not to be incivil and keep trying not to feel hatred, and that doesn't work. Then maybe there's a problem with that assumption. Maybe there's a deeper problem, right? And then you might think, let me think about a victim and victimizer, like a offender and a victim, a violator and a victim relation, whatever, arson, right? Some person burns down your house, and then you get angry at them and uncivil and try to get them to stop. Let's say they burn it down and then they knock on your door a year later and they're like, I'm going to burn it down again. And you now feel anger and something that might be hatred in your feelings. And you think that you should do things that would be characterized as uncivil to that. Is the root of the problem hatred and incivility, or is the root of the problem somewhere closer to the arson? And a lot of us know property rights violations, right? Hatred is just a symptom. Now, there might be another component of your frame that it maybe allows hatred the wrong way, but there's different things that on the surface look like hatred. If someone's going to burn down your house again and your neighbor's house and other houses and going to kill people, and you shoot them to prevent that, that isn't necessarily wrong. Maybe there's something maybe it somehow is, but it's not obviously wrong. If you want or clearly, like one thing I understand, if you want them to suffer, then you don't need that. That doesn't help it. There's no benefit. But shooting them might be reasonable, right? You see, someone on the surface might look at it and say, oh, you're being violent, hateful, and very uncivil shooting that person. That's absolutely uncivil, right? But shooting them actually is not a problem. It's not even necessarily wrong at all. It might be actually very right and might even be heroic if it's difficult and you have to find them and get past other things and rescue a lot of people. Like there's actually countless movies, right? Thousands and thousands of movies that show exactly some form of that. And we cheer for the hero who has to go through all kinds of hardships in order to end up actually even killing in many cases someone who's going to really violate a lot of people and have violated and will continue to violate. So there must be something very normal and reasonable about that, or at least potentially. Right. And I don't see an obvious flaw in it. I'm always curious because Jesus said things that indicate that maybe there's something else to find there, that maybe we just sit there and get burned and no matter what, robbed. And the way forward is to just take it all and love the person totally back. But maybe we can love them in a certain sense. We can want to discuss things with them as much as we possibly can, as much as they'll let us. We want them to change. We hope that they'll have another life of some sort after we kill them, and that there's hope for them and that they'll end up being in a wonderful place at some point. Right. And I do feel that way about anyone, no matter how they violate me. But the jury's out on killing, and it certainly seems like it's reasonable in certain circumstances. And I certainly wouldn't fault somebody else for circumstances. And I've cheered in plenty of movies, including the Avengers and all that stuff, right? When there's been killing done to stop violators. It's not the justice, it's stopping the obvious future ongoing massive violation. Okay, so I brought that up as an example of you spot a wrongness and you're trying to look for where the problem is. And there's no way to know. If you knew where the problem was immediately, you'd go to it. But sometimes you don't know where the problem is. You just know there's a problem and you start to look around, right? And the very looking is the right thing to do. And there might be all kinds of things you already know and have figured out that'll help narrow down your search. That's great. That's exactly what I'm talking about, right? The more in essence, the overall success method can be boiled down. All my details here are useful, but it can also be boiled down in a certain way to keep narrowing down your search, right? There's indications that you need to search, right? If you don't know you're going to win, then you're looking to improve on your framework until you win, rather than just finding the right recipe and in practice trying to then prove that the rest of your framework is already right. That's in practice how people act. If you look for that, you're doing the right thing. If you to be on the lookout for accidentally getting into where you're trying to prove that you're already awesome, your plan's already right, you don't need to prove that plan A is right. You just do plan A until you either win or until a clearly better, efficient to change over to plan B comes up, right? In a way, very simple. So you find by looking at, and then it builds, right? The winning by seeking the winning frame. So you identify a win that you'd like to have. Then you basically do one thing. You seek to clarity on the winning frame, which means the components of the winning frame, which involves both thinking and acting. You can take action in a way that looks very normal on the surface. But what doesn't look normal is what happens when a wrongness potentially comes up. What people will do by default is delete, marginalize the wrongness, right? Again, to illustrate this with politics, just because a good illustration comes to mind, it's not that difficult to me, to understand that the way taxation works is if you don't pay taxes or give up the money for taxes or cough up the tax money, you go to jail, right? If you try to escape from jail or live your life normally, despite people trying to put you in jail, you can even get killed, right? And in jail, rape is fairly common, right? For women, typically guards do it. For men, it's often inmates that do it, right? But it's well documented, well researched, predictable. There's not really much being done about it. So you can't separate them, right? If you are in favor of taxation, you're basically in favor of the law, either the law regarding taxation or a law that you want to have happen, right? If you want the tax rate to be twice as much on rich people, then you want a law to exist that said that, right? So that law you believe, which means you believe in, that goes together with wanting someone that doesn't pay it in jail. If you try to say, but in practice, so I'm talking about what people normally do in practice regarding potential wrongness that they could see. What they do is they delete and marginalize. It's unbelievably common for me to ask a tax believer, right? A person who wants taxation or some law that they like about taxation. I ask them why they want me in jail. And they're like, I don't want you in jail. Or they'll just say, I don't understand what you mean. You wouldn't believe how common it is for people to say, you won't go to jail. Literally, they'll actually say, which blows to this day. Again, the fact that it blows my mind is an obvious flaw in my own mental model of people thinking, right? I have a lot of accuracy that I've built up about how people think, but I still have some problem because it really shocks me when people literally actually word for word verbatim, you won't go to jail, which is just so bizarrely counterfactual, right? The whole Manafort is publicly, literally in jail right now for exactly that. There's millions and millions of people who also paid no taxes or the same amount of tax money or less than Paul Manafort in the years that he's going to jail for. And because they didn't make any money or because they made the right amount of money where their taxes, the amount they paid was enough, they're not going to. So he's actually going to jail for making money, not for not paying taxes. He's going to jail for making money, right? Because he did the exact same actions as other people. So what this is an amazing, it's like an experiment you could do at home. You know, like with my son, there's all kinds of little science experiments. You get these books and they give you a science experiment. You can mix vinegar with baking, right? And you make a little volcano or something. Do that, or make a potato clock or whatever, right? So you can do an experiment at home and you can ask a taxer why they want you in jail. And you will see in real time what people do when they're confronted with a wrong. It seems to me, again, because I need to work on feeling and integrating the right model for how people act, think, and I have to figure out exactly what's going on to some degree. And I fill in gaps and detail, right? And the OMG wait helped me see recently, helped me see that part of what goes on for them is fairness. For her, she actually stated, I don't want you to go to jail. Yet she feels like there should be taxes. And I saw that what she does, it against the marginalization. She doesn't see jail. Like what fairness is so big in her mind that it's like all that's on her screen. And so she just feels like what's going on now with taxation is unfair. And for her foundation, for her fairness, as far as I can tell, and I don't want to make this personal to her, and we had a constructive conversation. So none of what I'm saying is being nasty or condescending or criticism. I'm saying that I help me see this. What happens is the fairness is so big and overwhelming, and that in practice, it acts like a foundation. What people think that fairness, again, it is a floor. It's something to stand on. You don't have that it justifies anything, right? A floor justifies anything that, they in that way, in a certain way. So she wants fairness and she feels like it's unfair. Now, if I bought into that platform by accident, which people do often, they'll try to say, oh, the rich do pay a lot, or they tell how much taxes I did pay, or that I'm not inherently rich. In my entire 20s, I made about $10,000 an entire year, way less than even what we think of poor people make. I was fine. I didn't have dad. I paid for my life and I was fine. I lived a normal life. Just doesn't actually cost that much to live, say 20 years ago. And I had the exact same political views, or I don't like thinking of them as political views, but whatever, just to be simple. Anyhow, if you start to talk about how much money the rich do pay, or that in my case, can't not pay like a ton of taxes, in, in a kind of humorous way, I'm so good at making actual profit that I just actually make personally, or have made a lot of just money that I don't then spend on experiences, right? The way to seemingly make a lot of money in terms of salary that you tell people you make, and you could even say it was all profit, but then you spend it on lifestyle that business related, and then you get a lot of taxes. But I actually walk away where at the end of the year, I have a ton of actual money that I haven't spent on my lifestyle. So then I don't, all because that I want to, not money that not to have to be a priority. Right? When you do that, there's no way. Maybe there's some crazy lawyer scheme, but the trouble is I'd have to buy into a zillion scams and spend probably hundreds of $1,000s paying different people claiming I'd have to pay taxes in order to do some scheme. And then I wouldn't even know if the scheme worked until I got audited. So I'd be living in fear and uncertainty. The tax code is indecipherable. There's literally, I don't mean this virtually or mostly, it literally is indecipherable. So you have no idea how much money the government even lets you keep unless you get audited. If you don't get audited, you literally just sit there and you don't own your own money. You can act like you do, and that might overlap with reality, but they can audit you and take it all away. They can just say, we don't approve of that answer. We think you made more money than you did, and they just assert that, whatever they end up believing. right? I'm not saying in practice that happens all the time, but it's all part of this. But certainly if I were to try to pay less, point is I could talk about that, but that won't change anyone's mind because I'm not getting underneath the platform. As soon as the platform is fairness, or as soon as the platform is about being civil, I can't win. Maybe I can have a stalemate. Maybe I can get people, maybe I can convince a few people, maybe I can get people on my side to cheer for me, so to speak, that already agree with me. But in order to change someone there, you have to get underneath the things. You can't argue as if that's a valid platform, right? You need to get underneath. Anyway, but the specific point here that relates to winning frame is that we go about building winning frames by spotting wrongnesses, but we need to be seeking understanding. If we don't, and we can see what it looks like in practice, how normally people don't, because when confronted with a wrongness, it like bounces off their head, right? It's marginalized and deleted. And I say that a lot, but again, I gave you an experiment you can do at home. And here's a very important thing. Whenever you spot someone else being stupid to a degree that you can't imagine, accept and believe that there's a way that same thing, that you're doing the same somehow, some way, right? We all grew up in the same world. We all have all sorts of ideas that are still wrong, presumably. And unless and until we know that they're all wrong. So once again, overall, you want to be following the same thing, right? You don't just want to think you have the recipe for living your life. A lot of people do that, at least on a certain middle level, right? They might look like they're looking for a recipe for making money, but their overall recipe is fixed. Like they just want to accomplish certain things in their life, right? They want to feel like they're making enough money or have a certain amount of money and have enough status and whatever the heck they want. Love, relationship, they think that's the recipe. So again, this iterates in so many ways. So we figure out, I'll summarize now and then go to the discussion. We imagine what a win looks like, and we try to do that right. Keep it basically simple. And even with that, you can figure it out on your own. Like I've talked and the best I can for this amount of time. And at this point in time, of course, I can get better in the future. But just notice if there's a certain way you can identify the win without doing it wrong. If you feel like you're doing it wrong, then keep trying to think about how to do it right, and you'll keep getting there, right? Don't just feel like you already should have it right because I talked for a while, or after you think about it for an hour and listen to me twice, then you also don't deserve to understand it, right? You understand it when you understand it. You don't put an artificial timeline on understanding something. If it matters, and this matters, then just keep seeking until you understand what it means to identify the win. But you might already get it, however, whatever. Then then it doesn't really matter what you do as long as it's framed overall in service of building a frame. So you can do what looks very much like just making a normal business plan thing on it, as long as you understand that you're making the plan like making a test sales letter, that you're going to be split testing a whole bunch of times. Right. By the way, with me, I often don't really do a lot of split testing of sales letters based on the way that I've always marketed in the past and so forth. So even then, we often don't do it, right, with sales letters. But I'm just using that as a kind of a example. I'm not even telling you that you should or shouldn't split test sales letters. If you were to think of it that way, right? Whatever, as you're making a plan, you can take inventory as best you can of what you do know. Okay. Let's just say the overall structure, product, traffic, conversion. Regarding conversion, that you want to have a vision and then follow a justification. But if you win on the vision part, you're in great shape. The justification just needs to be, or at least you potentially know these. At least you have those as a potential frame, right? At least David said those things and let me try it. You know that you ideally want your communication to be clear with who you're communicating with, like your JV partner. But at the same time, you don't want to come across like, and if you try to go overboard on clarity in practice, then it can even come across wrong. So you need to work on either you're a master of it, or the more you get a sense with that individual person, and then as you do that, you'll get meta strategies on communicating clearly, which include little signal of when miscommunication feels like it isn't happening, but it actually does. Had a cool little moment communicating with my wife where I stopped and memorized it well for myself because it was a potentially useful thing for me in the future to have this kind of a go-to mental picture. My son Chance, who's 6, I have a car seat for him that is fairly simple. It's not like one of those big, heavy car seats at this point. And it has, and it, I didn't even know this at the time. And at the time of this conversation, I learned it during the conversation, but I didn't know it and I assumed it didn't because I didn't realize that I assumed it didn't exist. The seat can be broken into 2 parts, the back of the seat and the bottom of the seat that you sit on. I didn't know it could be pulled apart. And then I have another component that I use for this car seat, which is a mat that goes underneath the car seat to protect the leather on my car. So there's the mat and then there's the car seat. It turns out the car seat can be broken into 2 parts. My wife used the car seat because she was driving another child as well. I was meeting my wife, so I needed to, but she forgot to take the car seat out. But I was meeting her, so she would have what I thought she had the entire car seat because I thought that's all that I didn't think that it could be divided into 2 parts, like the back and the bottom. So I figured she had the full car seat, and I just had to bring the mat. And so I was like, okay, you bring the car seat, I'll bring the mat. And she's, oh, you'll bring the bottom, right? And I was like, yeah, the mat goes in the bottom, right? And so we went back and forth, actually like 2 or 3 times or more, where we were talking past each other, and I didn't know that we were, and she didn't know that we were. So it wasn't like we knew we were, and it sounded like, oh, just agree. But something like there was some way that, again, like I'm not perfect, but there's a way that I do this a lot and I care about it. I care about the meta of it and so forth and more than even just my relationship. In this case, it was relatively trivial, but there was something that it wasn't like clearly clear, right? Like maybe there was a reason she was talking this way that didn't really, like I wouldn't call the mat that goes onto the seat the back. I would like, and every time I felt like I was clarifying, she kind of said something that was like, I could make it, but I was having to force it. So somewhere or another, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I realized to keep going or to ask or to communicate in such a way that she told me that you could split the car seat into 2 parts and she had taken just the seat and I needed to find the back that was still in her garage and additionally bring that. And I did. And in that case, I did it right. There's plenty of times with her or whatever, I've done it wrong, but now I have that memorized and now you have that little anecdote where that sort of thing, that in that case, it was relatively trivial, but that type of thing sometimes will come up where it's not trivial. It really matters and it's important. That's an example though of the type of thing that you both can get better with an individual person and not talking past each other. And then overall you can get the meta. And that's the type of thing that you want to be looking for when you're making your plan, rather than looking to act by default, you're going to look to prove that you're already right about it. And then the way you measure progress is also different, right? People normally measure progress by proving that they're right, and often we can skew data to look at what looks right. Oh, you know how 2 people can give each other progress reports for months? That sounds like they're both crushing, and yet things don't work very well. You ever seen that? Or you can imagine that happening, right? That's the kind of thing that happens when people are trying to present their best face, right? And then projects will take forever and ever. And, it turns out that I, over time, built the skill of making projects get finished and happen very much more fast than they otherwise would do without just being a tyrant or pushing people. I basically do it in a way that's purely constructive and it's very noticeable. But by doing this is my central meta for doing that. My central frame for doing it is that I look at things that way. I'm always trying to like understand better about the frame of what's going on, the framework, which can include details. Again, they help build the framework, integrate with the framework, whatever. But whether it's more surface level details, whether it's more meta things, whether it's both, I'm looking to fill in the frame. I'll give one final example and then go to discussion. When it comes to who you're looking for in a romantic partner or a love relationship partner, instead of just trying to identify the characteristics you want, then what really you want to do is basically both date and think about the dating in a way where you keep trying to, again, I'm going to switch back to just the visual image of, it's like you picture a silhouette of somebody like Benjamin Franklin or whatever, and then imagine the opposite of it, like the silhouette, Benjamin Franklin's head being white and the area around him being black. And you're like trying to fill in the area around it. And then that fills in better and better what to look for. And that's a little bit vague, but I'll give you the specific with a final, very quick example that I've talked about the type of example before with annuities. I, of course, actual insurance companies created the idea of and the actualization of annuities years ago, many hundreds of even probably hundreds of years ago in various forms. Obviously, I did not do that. I neither came up with the idea nor I did that. However, in my own life, in my own mental space, I invented, so to speak, the idea of annuities by trying to figure out both money and investing. I wasn't like trying to invest to get super rich, to strike it rich with investing, but I was trying to figure out how to think about money, how to think about investing, what to actually do. Do I buy gold? Do I get stock? Do I do an index fund with the S&P 500 and get the historical 11%? But yet, in actual practice, people, individual investors get like a 2 point something percent return on actually doing that somehow in real life, even though if you look at the actual S&P itself averages out to 11% return apparently. Anyhow, what the heck do you know? Bonds, municipal bonds, mostly tax free. What do you do? Do you go with an investment advisor? Do you go with a bot? Or do you go with a discount one? Do you go with a full service one? Do you make a financial plan with a financial planner? I tried and or thought about a bunch of things and actually did a number of things. All of it helped me hone in on the following moment that I had a friend who knew something about this stuff. I didn't know exactly what they knew, or I would have already known about annuities, but they generally dealt with this stuff. And I'll talk to them. I said, what I need is this, where I put money into it and that money is gone. It's not really mine anymore. In other words, like psychologically, neither myself or my spouse will feel like we have all that money to adjust our spending with. And really the government can't hardly even touch it, probably ideally, right? It would still be a general good thing if it could. So it wouldn't be good that it could, but it would, regardless of the detail, I'd still basically want this, but ideally it would be that. But it'd be great to put my money somewhere that I didn't have, basically. But then I would be paid out like at some point in my life when I was 60, 65, whatever, monthly for the rest of my life. I figured all of that out from scratch, so to speak, but I didn't do it through trial and error, right? That would be a mischaracterization of this process, not trial and error. It's filling in a framework is very different than trial, because with trial and error, you can characterize it as progress, like the famous supposed quote from Edison that goes something like, I didn't fail to create the light bulb. I found another element that doesn't work, right? What really might have been happening was he was filling and maybe not. But now, of course, he was filling in a framework of understanding better what might work. Now, if you literally have a finite number of potential filaments and they're all sitting in front of you and there's 1,000 of them, then yes, you can just use trial and error. Of course, by logic, that'll work, right? In real life, trial and error is not plausible because there's something like infinite possibilities, right? You can't figure out a great sales letter purely through trial and error. What are you going to do? Try every combination of every word, right? There's literally Google's, right? 1 to 100th power of potential word combinations you could use. So you can't use actual trial and error if you think about it. And even a lot of things that people claim as trial and error is not, right? To the extent that it works, it's following this process where if I'd use trial and error, then what I would do is actually have to get annuities and try it somehow. But how do you try that? I'd have to live my entire life to try all these different strategies, right? If you think about it, to live a whole bunch, like thousands of different lives, or at least dozens, and try different investment strategies and different ones. And even then, maybe because of luck being involved, I wouldn't even know what worked unless I could duplicate it over and over. So now I would need hundreds of lives. So trial and error is actually a very narrow process that only works in the last few steps after you've narrowed things down so much that there's only a few actual possibilities, right? Or it wasn't trial and error anyway. It was what I'm talking about. Either way, we don't want to call this trial and error. What I did was I kept building a framework until I was able to realize, oh, this is what it would have to look like. But I didn't find the recipe. I basically carved everything else off until I was like, oh, it has to look like, because the opposite of each of the things I said was unhelpful. If I took that same money and was able to put it in the stock market in a way that I couldn't touch it, the problem is I don't know what's going to happen with the stock market, right? What I wanted was where I knew exactly what was going to happen, right? Overall, there's still Armageddon, or so to speak, financial Armageddon, or the dollar goes to zero or something, right? They could tell, but I talked about that. You can't deal with everything, right? That way. And how do I know where to draw the line with dealing with everything or not? When can I easily act? I'm not worrying about it. I can easily act on being fine with the way that my annuities are set up. Easily, I do. If it turns out that there's financial Armageddon and everything goes to crap, then I'll deal with that at the time, but I can act on that. I don't actually worry about it. I don't actually act as if it's a priority to deal with Armageddon. If I was, then I would, if that was imposing itself on me, then I'd have to deal with that somehow, but it isn't. So I move forward. But that's almost one of the best examples I can think of. I did fast, but still, it might really help you get a sense of what it means to narrow things down. I did the same thing with realizing what I wanted in a love partner, a wife, or someone that I would date to hope to be as a potential wife, and obviously then become a wife. Obviously, you don't start as your wife on day one when you meet them. But I realized what to look for, and I've characterized it before. What I was able to do was get to the point where I could show how the opposite both was absurd and that the topic itself was important. I knew, I identified that something had to be important and that the opposite of that, one of the two opposites was clearly wrong. So the topic was, so an example is chemistry, right? The idea of us being attracted, like the idea of people being attracted to each other in a love relationship, like kind of both physically and whatever's like pseudo physically, where you feel attracted, could involve their personality, can involve their facial expression, their kind of the feel of their aura. I don't mean that new agey. I just mean the simple interpretation. That type of thing, that matters. Sometimes people talk and act as if it doesn't, but that seemed clearly wrong to me. Because you just picture, imagine a love relationship where people are like, oh, looks shouldn't matter in some way, or intelligence should matter more. But I imagine the person being intelligent, I can give, what does intelligence mean? They can do well on a main test. They can quote Edgar Allan Poe really well and compare it with Shakespeare, or they can come up with as many words that start with P or 13 letters real quick. Or I don't, what. They can solve problems well, nifty, but often people can solve problems well in a certain way. And they can't otherwise. If they overall as a meta solve problems, that's more like wisdom. And that would come from seeking understanding, right? Someone who generally seeks understanding pretty well, which means they don't have a lot of blocks to seek understanding. Seeking understanding is natural if we don't have blocks, but people have all sorts of blocks. So I want someone that has not so many blocks to seeking understanding about building a framework is going to, in practice, solve problems. It has nothing to do with intelligence per se, or very little. It's much more correlated with the stuff we talk about in LOI. So an overall sense of seeking understanding or not being overly blocked with it, where I kind of probe things that someone might turn off on and block me out and tell me to shut up. And if someone didn't do that and instead would discuss things, even if they were a little bit difficult, then that's good. I needed that. And also that we had mutual chemistry, right? Mutual attraction in a way that was probably going to stick around. There's a certain type where you can notice that someone's going to remain attracted to you versus that they're just attracted at the moment. You can tell over not that long a time if you're maybe looking for it without trying to prove that you're right. I didn't want to prove I was right with someone. I wanted to genuinely find it. So I narrowed it down to that, to the same process. So again, you're looking for the winning frame. You could say you're looking to build the framework. You can reword this. I'm not saying it would be better wording, but it'd be alternative that'll further help characterize it. We could say we're looking to build a framework that is more and more likely to lead to the win, right? And then we know we built it when we won, typically, unless we somehow had such clarity that we know just from the logic of the frame. That can happen again in the meta sense, like in an overall sense, everything's going to be okay. I've talked about the proof of God and how things overall have to work in the world, where ultimately things, right? That's an overall winning frame that's simple and profound enough that we can understand it. And so in that way, we ultimately know we're going to win, right? When it comes to something more in the middle of things, so to speak, where it's like whether a JD project is going to win, typically we'll know a whole number of useful components of a frame, but then there'll be a whole bunch of other things we don't know for sure. And we're looking to build the framework. We can plan, we can take action, but all of it needs to be in service of building the framework. And then the recipe, saying the recipe will follow is just another way of saying that the framework will fill itself in. It'll build, right? As I've said in different ways, but that's how you find a winning frame, right? And again, and the way to implement all of this is basically to look out for, hey, wait, do I have a sense of what a win what a win looks like? Do I know what my plan A is for getting? Do I have a good sense that the purpose of plan A is that it doesn't make any sense to have no clarity on how to do any action, right? But the purpose of it is that I'm just eyeballing at this point, given my existing framework, which isn't good enough, or else I would know for sure I was going to win and exactly what to do. If you know for sure exactly what to do, then of course you do it and you win, right? You don't need anything from me at that point. Otherwise, we're talking about what to do otherwise. Otherwise, your framework is inadequate, which means that inherently plan A is a guess, right? Like an eyeballed, educated, so to speak, guess. But you know that's your framing on plan A in general, right? And so then you follow it, but you're following it in order to, of course, you either get lucky and you just follow it right to the over the threshold, to the target, to the win. But as you go and you spot any kind of wrongnesses or things where now you make a distinction, right? That's going to help you in your framework build, right? You learn something, see something, you think, you might just think of something. When you think of something, it'll add to your framework, but it might possibly be incorrect, right? But that's all obviously part of the process as you think through this thing for yourself, right? You might think, oh, maybe I should use this headline, right? You eyeball, what is that? What happens? You do that. You eyeball it. Does it look better than what you had? If so, change it and go from there, right? You can record the previous one you had or throw it out forever, whatever, right? But as long as you're generally have an idea you want to have clarity on what a win looks like. It makes no sense not to have, again, what the opposite of not having clarity on what a win looks like, right? Keep it simple, but not having clarity makes no sense. Then you eyeball plan A, understanding that you'll switch to plan B as your framework builds if it makes sense, right? With the cost of switching, and you have to compare it to a clarity on plan A and see that plan B is definitely better. This works in small scale, large scale, like a Matryoshka doll, right? Kind of little dolls inside of big dolls. And you do this in the framework builds. In practice, this plays out differently. There's aspects of it that on the surface look the same as normal, but in practice, very different, very effective. And it's my best attempt at explaining in a new, somewhat new, somewhat old way, in an effective way to help you guys, regardless of how far we got on this webinar or not. Okay, lots of comment here. Let's take a look. Great. We were talking about things, say hello. Okay, Mike commented on something I said. Yeah, David was explicitly painstaking about all financial details when something will be paid. Right, I talked about that in the beginning. I found that people confuse planning and goals. Right. Notice that I pretty much managed to not use the word goals here. I wasn't trying to do that or not. But the word goals reminds me of like religion or politics. It has so many different partially overlapping, partially not overlapping meanings at this point that it's too vague and confusing. And there's a bunch of wrong ideas mixed in with a bunch of right ideas about it and so forth. What we want to do is represent all the stuff that the word goals is talking about and planning and all that. And we're just trying to write here what the win looked like. I may have found my first tattoo. Some always reminded. Yeah, excellent. It's really easy to overlook this. Again, it's potentially easy to misinterpret what I mean, but not over time, not if you seek and work on it yourself. There's nothing ultimately special about me. And then I did my best at explaining it as best I could. Combined with that and your own thinking, you'll get an understanding. I would say I very consistently have this in mind, whether it's a particular phone call, Michael. You don't know when I've reminded us about that. Wait, what are we looking to do on this call? We might be meandering away from that. Or how did what you say relate to what we're trying to accomplish? I don't say that condescendingly. I say it because maybe I missed it. Maybe I didn't realize, or if I didn't make the connection, there might have been one that I want to know. Of course, I wouldn't say that to some people because it might sound obnoxious, but Mike is either used to it sounding obnoxious or it doesn't sound obnoxious or some combination thereof. So it all worked okay. But on a large scale, small scale, consistently, I'm aware of what a win looks like with this webinar. I have the sense of what a win looks like, at least. And then, but of course, with any webinar, it's a point in time, both with what I say and at the time that I have to say it, would have to use whatever framework exists at the time of the webinar and go with it. At which point I'm just basically eyeballing my way through it, just to illustrate what I mean by things like that. Keon laughed at what Micah said about the tattoo of what would the win look like. Mine would probably be remove failure conditions until the win. That's my Ragnarok way of characterizing this. Of course, it's in some way, all of this is repetitive, right? But it doesn't matter if we're repetitive, if we get it, if we have already gotten it, it helps to still look at it. It helps me to look at it this way in these different angles. We can always, I think we're all probably, given that I am, we're probably all, or possibly all at least, not that might be people that are just purely better at this than me. And I mean that for sure. Then now we're trying to integrate it still and not screw it up here and there. It's so common to screw this stuff up from doing things right. So Keon says mine would probably be remove the air conditioning till the win. I had that as a sticky on the home screen of my phone. I love it, Keon. Thank you. That's awesome. Michael said, since there's no editing. Oh, okay. So we need an editing function. Right now, there's 3 dots that don't have anything attached to them. I'm sure that'll be changed where we can edit. We're obviously still at the ground floor of our platform. I don't know if it's redundant or what would the win look like? Right, of course, maybe that would be the second tattoo is remove the other conditions until the win. Right? Dave said, thank you for giving context to approaching discussing what the win would look like. You're welcome. Michael says, question. When there is a real deadline that needs to be hit, I'm not understanding how I can create a winning frame when there's a time constraint. Okay. I might have answered that regarding like a webinar. This process always is the straightest distance between 2 points. It's always the most efficient. How do I create a webinar? Right. I build up a frame until the webinar happens, and then I have to do whatever I do. Right. Now, if I was doing a different type of webinar, then my framework could look different in different situations, right? I obviously did not prioritize for this webinar appearing like I had the whole efficient structure of slides where I covered everything within a 50-minute time span. I spent 10 minutes on each slide. Each slide had certain components. Obviously, that wasn't a priority. I certainly can do something like that, right? If I prioritize it, but I didn't. In a different type of webinar, I could well do that, right? It's not that, right? So what, like we could say, what aspects of the framework you prioritize within a task would relate both to the task and to deadlines, right? But this overall scheme is always going to be true. So really the time constraint just affects priorities, including how much of the other parts of your life you neglect, put off, or whatever. And I don't mean put off in a bad way, just could be bad, but how much of your actual hours per day you spend on something might expand. You have a time constraint on something that otherwise is going to have a big impact in a good way if you hit it or a bad way if you don't. But there's really no difference actually if there's a deadline. You still build out the framework on what if I had a deadline for figuring out my financial plan, right? How would I operate any differently? The way I would, if it was an important deadline, was I would just have to put more time and focus into it, and more creative focus, more actual time, etc. Right? I basically would just prioritize the task overall relative to the rest of my life higher. It's the only thing you can do. This kind of overall success methodology that I've characterized in a zillion different ways, build the framework until you win. I'd said in different ways, right? Focus on frames rather than details. That can be misunderstood. And I tried to help clear that up today about details and framework do blend together. What you basically don't want to do, it's not whether or not you focus on the forest or the tree. This is, okay, let me say this. This is actually pretty good. What I'm about to say, I think, kind of well. We'll see. Whether or not you focus on the view from 30,000 feet or the details or the view from 1 foot, whether or not you look at the forest or the trees, whether or not you look at the framework or the details, that's the wrong question. What you fundamentally want to avoid, and this is like Keon tattoo, remove failure conditions. The main failure condition, the overall meta failure condition you want to avoid is slipping into where you're trying to prove that you and therefore your framework, aspects of your framework are already right. As soon as you slip into that, you're going to feel panicked. Your confidence is going to uh, not necessarily erode, but all of your plans are going to take on the following structure. Plan A had better succeed if you win, meaning like you both win and you feel good about yourself, your confidence builds, right? You get a cascade of wins when you win, but the minute you start to lose, you downward spiral. That's what happens whenever you slip into proving that your framework is right. So once again, it's not about details versus over frame. It's not about forest or tree, big picture details, even context or content. That's really the wrong question. What you fundamentally want to do is avoid, and when you spot it, when you avoid it by spotting, not by hoping not to spot. The minute you want to prove that you don't already do this fundamental thing, then you're meta screwed. So you're not going to, from this moment on, you don't want to start proving that you not, you probably know what I'm about to try to figure out the words that mean it. So let's start. So of course, what you want to avoid, what you want to not do is be proving that your framework's already right. You do want to be looking to see how to improve your framework and build it until you win. Be careful of the meta thing that could sneak. Your mind could be sneaky with this. Don't now try to prove that you always do that, that you have the meta frame of always. You don't want to declare, I am a person that always does not try to prove that I'm right. I'm a person who's always improving my frame, because then you basically are trying to prove that you are right about that. You may, in practice, you could say, I'm seeking to be that. You can acknowledge that maybe you've already succeeded. You don't need to have false humility and saying, no, I suck at this, or I'm wrong about this. You might be right, but you don't want to get yourself in a position where you're not sure, you can't be sure. It's involves how you can act in the future, and where you're trying to prove, yourself great. So it doesn't matter whether there's a deadline or not. That's like the Forrester trees. Do I have a deadline? Do I not have a deadline? Of course, you don't want a deadline like for no reason. You don't want a deadline that's plan A, has to be plan A. Do you think the problem isn't the deadline? The problem is the meta idea of plan A has to work. That's what you want to avoid. So you can let go of, I know I've talked about the deadline thing. That's more of a symptom. I was trying to figure out both how to be clear on this myself and how to say it. But now that I have, again, the deadline is not what matters or doesn't matter. It's not that you avoid deadlines. Deadlines, you want to, if you spot a deadline, you could see if it's an accidental case of plan A has to work. The plan is for plan A to succeed, right? Remember, the right way to do it is, yes, plan A is plan A. I'm going to stick with plan A unless it becomes clear that I should switch to plan B. One way that it would become clear is that plan A clearly fails, right? Clearly doesn't work for some reason, or the deadline isn't hit, et cetera. Then, of course, you then need to switch to something other than sitting around wishing the past was different, right? It's always wrong in every case to have a goal. If the win looks like the past is different, then you need to find a different win because you can't change the past. Oh, that's nice. Dave prayed for Julie and her mother. Thank you, Dave. That's awesome. Suleiman says, hi, David, and lovely OMG years. Love it. Karen says, what's up, Suleiman? Enjoying the web. Kian, great. Probably also means this platform, presumably, or maybe that means something different. Dave says, with regards to winning and finding the winning frame, I have a question about lack of intimidation. Oh, cool. In my epic ebook, there's an example of when that's one he wrote a few months ago, right? We have it on our homepage. Now, I don't know if it's on there. Might be in our free area /insider. Is it on our free area, Mike, /insider? Anyway, in Mike's epic ebook, there's an example of when that would be me, David Mills, you worked on the infomercial and the you can't say this, et cetera. Many people might be able to hear that and say, that's funny, great, right on. But in the same situation, they'd feel intimidated. And I'm going to insert some words. So what Dave is saying, in the same situation, they'd feel intimidated to do the same thing that Mike told the story about me doing. So to imitate me, they'd feel scared to do so, to do what I did. So how do we integrate this to the core and get to the root under it so we would be able to act without intimidation? In one sense, I'm talking before I see what I'm about to say. Sometimes I form the whole sentence in my head and then I check it and then I say it. But I'm not quite doing that sometimes in these things. So I might have to correct what I say after I say it, even if anyway. So overall, I'll presumably say more than this, but remember the overall meta scheme I talked about today of what does a win look like regarding intimidation, right? It looks like you think, all right, I want to imitate David in this way. Mike told the story about David and I like the way David handled it. I want to do the same personally as I'm speaking right now, a little fussy on the exact story. But anyway, I want to emulate David in some specific way that, from what I'm doing. So a win would look like you think that you want to do that. And then you go ahead and do it in a way that ultimately you would characterize that as not intimidated. Maybe you feel for a second a little bit of intimidation, but then you quickly look at it in a certain way where you don't feel very intimidated. As a matter of fact, you do it. So that's what a win would look like. And then you're going to build in your frame. What you would want to think in this case, for example, is suppose I didn't do what David would do. In case I didn't follow along with the story and do that thing. How would that turn out? What would I miss out on? What if I don't walk up and talk to this girl, right? How would that turn out? And what if I always do that? Now, on the other hand, you can also think, I don't exactly ask what would be the worst that would happen, but I think what problems could come up. If I ask what's the worst that could happen, there's some flaw in that. Some could try to explain it exactly, but it gets you into thinking of like kind of conspiracy, like the metaphorical to conspiracy theories. I'm not looking for the extremes of the worst possible thing that can happen. I'm looking for what reasonably could go wrong that I should reasonably look out for. Because again, in the first place, I'm thinking of doing something that I want to do that I think is constructive, but I'm a little worried about doing it, right? I'm worried about talking to a girl. I'm talking hypothetically. Of course, I'm married. I'm not actually talking to girls in coffee shops, whatever. But anyhow, so either I'm thinking of talking to a girl, I'm thinking of trying to push the particular prospect. I'm thinking of, again, emulating Dave Mills, right? Myself in a certain way, but um, what could reasonably go wrong? Like, not what the worst thing that could happen. Oh, she could pull out a gun and shoot me or whatever. She could turn out to tell all my friends what a buffoon I am and all her friends, and she knows everyone in town. I don't think of the worst case. I just think of what reasonably could happen. If there's some reason why that is reasonable to worry about, then worry. But again, I don't try to come up with make my worst fears in reality. But, and then you could think, how can I operate in a way where that wouldn't happen? Or sometimes you confront what reasonably might happen. It doesn't really matter, right? In that case, I worked out, all right, so suppose they're saying, I can't say this. And I say, why can't I say it? What's the consequence? What's the reasonable consequence that they're worried about? So what if that does happen? Then what, and then I think we could handle that. Or what if they get mad at me? I don't like confronting people, but there's a way that my dislike of confronting people, there are things I don't do because, like, I look at the risk reward on confronting people and I try not to add bad to confronting people. There's a real cost to confronting people. They might feel bad, and there's no reason for me to also subject myself to someone really disliking me or feeling upset with me or feeling hurt because something I said. Just when I talk about, for me, I didn't want to live with my parents are loving people. They were fine parents, et cetera. I appreciate very much all that they had to invest and do to raise me. But living with them, being a second child, my sister's 6 years older, there's a way that there's an assumption of incompetence that they hardly even realize is going on. It's not good. Similarly, right, like, realistically, people feeling negatively about us in our environment it affects our psyche to some degree. It doesn't have to be major, but depending on the situation, if you're living with them, that it's going to be pretty important. If it's just a fairly one-off or it's someone you might see once in a while, that could matter. So I'm giving an example of thinking through like the cost benefit of confronting, right? What I try not to do is add bad where I missed it. A parent might say to the kid, oh, you better do that or else. Or if you do that, you know what's going to happen. Like this kind of vague threat. I try not to like metaphorically have my brain do that to me where it's like vague. So I try to get clarity. It's a lot, again, like with the fear video where I talked about clarity will clear up a lot of the BS part that's adding to the feeling of intimidation in a useful way. I'll try to figure out, again, what's the real cost. So metaphorically, the parent was saying, or else, you try to figure out or else what exactly is the best you can. When I had to have jury duty, I tried to figure out exactly what the or else was. They in Tennessee that communicate with you in a way where they don't want to tell you what happens if you don't show up. Right? It's like the equivalent of like your parents saying or else. I finally, after literally like talking to 7 people, I got a cop to say, I have no idea whether this is true. They can lie to you. I think it's standard practice to lie to people. If you're a cop, literally, I don't like by the manual. I don't even mean accusing them. But she easily could have been making it up. But the trouble is, I didn't want to risk it in that case. But they were like, no, the judge can order us to come knock on your door and put you in jail. Or first we force you to explain why you didn't show up. And if you don't show up to that, then we put you in jail. Basically, it terminates with them knocking on my door and putting me in jail if I don't show up for jury duty. But tracking that down was really tough. But at least I tried to. Okay, or I did. At least I got an answer, whether it was truthful or not. Similarly with your brain, right? The good thing with your brain is you can basically, with other people, you don't have like full control of your brain, but you have a certain overall frame of control of your brain where you can boundary it and you can essentially force it in this way to tell you, oh, got nothing, right? Your brain laid down its cards and nothing there, right? They have what is it called? Like a jack high, nothing, right? No pairs, no, it's arbitrary, right? Or your brain gives you clarity, right? I guess the reason you have control ultimately is because if your brain doesn't have anything, then the burden of proof is on your brain to intimidate you, right? Because ultimately your brain's intimidating you or intimidating itself, right? One part of your mind's intimidating the other in essence, right? Fabricated. As much as it's not clear, then what does your brain do? Fabricates clarity, right? So it fabricates a feeling of intimidation for you. It makes it feel clear that you shouldn't do it, but it's gray. And you call it down, you realize it's doing that, and or you clear out the aspect of it doing that, and then there's some left over that's real clarity on some real consequences of doing what David would do or talking to that girl, right? And then you make a cost benefit analysis, so to speak, right? But literally we do that all the time. We don't call it such, but you make a cost benefit analysis. You make a judgment based now on clarity, or at least more clarity on whether to talk to the girl, whether to follow along with me on that story, whether to push it with someone on being an SEO client or what. You see what I'm saying? That would actually ended up, I think, coming out pretty well. Mike said, David, I believe he's talking about when you're willing away to walk away from the Isle of Man, dude. Yeah, those guys. Yeah, certainly. That was weirdly easy, right? Once I did that exact process that I'm describing to you. Instead of vaguely feeling scared of a business deal falling through, I think, what if it falls through? Here's what's going to happen. What if it doesn't fall through? What is the benefits to kissing their ass? And there were some, right? And what are the benefits to not kissing their ass? And kissing their ass involved, problem was kissing their ass involved basically waving our hand at product quality, right? Literally if OMG was Mike Long making a training manual for a hired coach who was not an entrepreneur, then that wouldn't be as good as Greg Morrison teaching SEO, right? And even if Greg participated, right? If he was making a manual for someone else. And even then, we don't even know how much they would follow that or who these people were or what, right? The cost was having a potential crap product, but where it's pretty predictable that it was going to be crap. And the cost of walking away from them was we would get their expertise and their investment money. And the cost is more than just a crap product. We'd give up control in other ways. Our percentage would be tiny, et cetera. But the real deal breaker was that on balance, if product quality was going to be great and people were going to succeed as members, and part of that, have to be that their coach was doing what they said, not just so the information will be right, but because the meta communication of someone doing SEO and monetizing it themselves versus someone who is an employee who's just parroting what that person's saying, the meta communication is radically different. I think radically important. I think that has a big impact on phones in this type of niche or this type of teaching. There's some things where that wouldn't be so important, but teaching entrepreneurs, I think it's radically important. So again, cost benefit on both ways, instead of my brain arbitrarily giving me a feeling like, oh, these guys are high status, they're all rich and all this and all that. And I'm supposed to behave a certain way around high status people. I'm supposed to want to work with them no matter what. Because a lot of people estimate this way, right? They consider nothing but perceived. They think it's actual status, but of course they can only act on perceived. And of course, in the entrepreneurial world and the teaching people how to make money, there's a hell of a lot of preening and posturing and BSing and big fish stories and I make this much a month when they're not even true about their, like a BS, half BS version story, whatever that took place in 1 month or in 1 week and they multiplied it by 4. The status thing's irrelevant. What's the practical effect of working with them? Like this kind of the status is used as vague. Again, it's used to fabricate clarity is one of the things, right? It's not going to actually really add clarity unless you're specifically considering it for them being like the figurehead in the marketing. Then it might be relevant as much as it really will affect conversion with the marketing, which it might, but often not nearly as much as people think. Anyhow, that's a pretty good answer to that. Oh, that's cool. Suleiman says, David, I can relate so much to the second child reference and assumption of incompetence. Yeah, it's just logical, right? Like psychologically logical. Where in my case, I have a sister 6 years older, so she's a girl who developed faster, and just tend to be more of what you're looking for in a child, right? With girls, and just in terms of going along and getting along and so forth. But anyway, anyone who's 6 years older is obviously going to just do everything better than somebody 6 years younger when you're a child. And so people just get used to that. Brian said, last week I had a discussion about the only definition of extortion with a police officer, and his response was just as you had experienced. Yeah, it's incredible. I can have both sides of the conversation myself in almost every case. I'm just doing my job. I read this in a book, Libertarianism, that kind of iconic book written about 20-ish years ago. I gave the author, but I don't have it on hand. But he's the one that pointed this out. This isn't even my wacky thinking. It's just out there on a fairly mainstream book. But he points out that literally the police are running a protection racket in a literal sense. You pay them money in the sense of form of tax, sales tax, typically a local, and real estate tax and so forth, right? Property tax. And if you don't pay it, they hurt you, right? They handcuff you, they put you in jail, they do whatever the heck. sell your house, right? Kick you out of your house. And if you do pay it, then you get their supposed protection, which doesn't really amount to protection. And even if it did, imposing it on you, right? It's still a protection racket if they protect you once in a while. But ironically, right, it makes us weak. I'm admittedly relatively pathetic when it comes to my own self-defense, just based on being coddled with I'm not even coddled in real life, right? They don't really actually protect you. It's just not realistic. It's not even that they do or don't want to, or that they are or aren't incompetent at that, but it's not realistic to proactively protect someone from crime in most cases. But yet at the same time, we tend to be very complacent about our own self-defense because of the general existence of police and the fact that if you're a little bit too strident with your own self-defense, they can attack you. They arrest you and so on and so forth. You could get a job. So Brian's pretty courageous here, crazy man like me, or else this guy was particularly patient, whatever. And then the policeman said, Brian said to the policeman, well, you could get a job at McDonald's and feel a lot better about how you earn a living. The policeman said, I don't see anything wrong, which is what I said, marginalizing, right? He doesn't see, look at his language, the police officer's language. I don't see anything wrong with it. And you can interpret that literally, right? Like I'm doing my job, the overall marketing story of the police, right? They're necessary. They protect us. They protect and serve. They're doing public service, right? We all know the story. And that story can take up the whole screen, right? And wrongnesses can just be put off screen, right? They can be minimalized, right? Marginalizing is a lot like when you click on a window, the little line that puts it down to your taskbar and it's click off the screen, right? So he used language that communicated like neurolinguistic programming. It's basically true. The police officer literally does not see what's wrong with it. And somehow people are able to maintain a thought process where you give them an idea and they can't see it while you're talking about it. I feel like that's a little hard for me to do. So I'm trying to like reverse engineer to how it has to be for these people that like, I tell them, of course, you go to jail if you don't pay your taxes. And they're like, you don't go to jail, or I don't want you to go to jail, but I want taxes to be fair. And somehow they can hold those thoughts, or they cannot be, it's not that they hold those thoughts in their mind so much as that they manage to not see what we're describing. And therefore the contradictions aren't seen, right, in a certain way. And they just basically affirm them both like within a second of each other without having clarity so that they're looking at them together where it would be clear. Like if you look at the idea of being married and the idea of being a bachelor, there's a certain way that if you can hold those concepts in your mind properly, you can see that it's a contradiction, that a married bachelor cannot exist. There's some way that their mind blocks them from doing this, and and I guess what's happening is their mind has to block them from seeing both together in the way that would allow you to see that they're a contradiction. And then they don't feel or see that the mind is blocking them. So the mind blocks it from being seen properly. And then they don't realize that's happening or feel it's happening. And they don't if they wanted to realize it, they would slowly realize it, right? But then they don't want to. And the result is evil, right? That's where evil comes from, is the kind of deep foundation or frame of not wanting to see if your mind is blocking you from seeing, in essence, right? It's one way to characterize. And then Brian goes on and says, so if the mafia had a job, then you would take it. And the police officer says, you bet. The police officer was a little bit screwing with Brian to some degree at that point, but at the same time, doesn't matter. The fact that after all that, they treat it flippantly, or I could say it may have been flippant when he said, you bet. But the very fact that they're flippant communicates the same. I had a similar, even more extreme experience during jury duty after they did all the jury selection stuff, and it was just intermission. I was speaking in conversational tones to a couple of police officers, asking them to not continue running a slavery ring, right, of jury duty. And it resulted in them walking me back to, it's like out in the hole for some reason. The judge is sitting at the table. She didn't really have a chambers as a casual court, but she said for every word I spoke after that, I think she thought I was trying to get out of jury duty, but she was just about to dismiss us, like from being in the audience for it. So that made no sense, but I think but regardless, she gave me some weird quick speech about people died for me to have the right for all this, apparently to be enslaved. Apparently people died so that I could be enslaved. But regardless, she literally told me that for every word I spoke from that moment, I would go to jail for 10 days, which means without trial. And it means if I spoke enough words, I go to jail for life. So in America, you can go to jail for life for speaking out against slavery, including in a There's no extenuating circumstance. I didn't yell it. Didn't do it disrupting anything. It was just during an intermission. They were already done with the selection and so forth. They might claim that I was somehow tainting the jury pool or some crazy thing by speaking out against slavery. Apparently, speaking out against slavery taint jury. But yeah, fascinating. In America, speaking out against slavery can put you in jail for life with no trial. That's exact fact. When I say that we live in a full tyranny, it's not an opinion. It's, of course, full fact. For her to assert that is asserting ownership over my body, period, not temporarily, but permanently, right? Because they forced me to come there, which means they feel like they can force me to come at any time, right? So they're asserting full, permanent ownership over my body. They don't act on that ownership all that much, but they assert it, literally. So again, they assert that I'm fully owned in body, and of course, my money and physical property, a real property, like a real estate house, owned by the government. Fascinating. Which is I think a very reasonable definition of a full tyranny is when the government owns your body and all of your property and money and real property legally and really. They sometimes pass legislation or have legislation that allows you to keep your body and use it how you see fit within boundaries that are also regulated and not just in the bounds of actual morality. So I call the United States a full tyranny, not a soft tyranny, not a partial tyranny. In practice, other countries can be an even worse tyranny. Probably just about every government on the planet assert full ownership over people's bodies, property, and money. I don't mean to single out the United States in that way. It might in practice be a better place to live than many other places for me, given that I speak English and that I already live here and have a whole ton of things that are in place here. And it'd be very inefficient for me to move, then it might be the best practical place for me to live, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that the founding of America was, relatively speaking, terrific and like a practical miracle, even though there were flaws in it and flawed assumptions and so forth. Relative to other attempts, it was pretty nifty. But anyhow, Mike, the butt comment was hilarious. Oh, probably about the Facebook ad. I'm grateful to see things here instead of Facebook. Yeah, I love being on here. Our new platform. Again, huge thanks. Can't have enough thanks for Keon, who's pretty much done it all. I might as well, since we talked so much about that incident from the book, and Dave typed it. He said, here's an excerpt. This is quoting what Mike wrote. David's first move was to fire Doug and Gary's lawyer from the project. The day of the dress rehearsal for the first show, the lawyer insisted we stop everything so he could role play what it would potentially be like in court should we go forward with the show as written. In his mind, the clock would start ticking on an FTC investigation should we go forward. This lawyer role played both the prosecution and the judge and wouldn't stop yelling. He demanded that we rewrite the show. Okay, so this is a different incident I thought it might be. There was a few incidents that you might want to emulate about me and like just, again, being tongue in cheek there. But so I wasn't intimidated to say this lawyer absolutely has to be not listened to and has to be off the project. People would normally be intimidated about that for a number of reasons, such as that a lawyer would know more about the law than them, yada, yada. In this case, I don't have to know about the law. What I understand is that what I want to do is find out first what converts for an infomercial. Then when we're testing an infomercial, the FTC is not going to crack down. The FTC is just not realistic at all. Even if it did, there'd be nothing to really crack down on. We wouldn't have made any money. They don't shoot you or put you in jail for putting an infomercial on that violates their guidelines. They might force you to give back money that you've made or whatever. Maybe they'll fine you a little bit. Yeah. Okay. And anyway, they're just not going to pay attention. Just like if you make a website and you start ranking it and you ask us, oh my God, what if we're violating FTC guidelines on privacy policy or something? It's absolutely unrealistic that the FTC is going to contact you at that point. Just not going to happen. I'm not being Pollyanna, it's not going to happen. But that point is crucial to the story because what we want to do is converting on an infomercial is not a given and it's not easy. And so it would be and it was critical at that point. This is after we'd already tried an infomercial that the lawyer had played a large role in screwing with. And it converted much better than an infomercial they did for someone else that a lawyer had screwed with, but it did not convert well enough to be a profitable infomercial. But the fact that it converted better than different persons, apple to apples, given that the lawyer had screwed both, was promising. So then we tried again, and I was able to dictate certain frames. Okay. Details were not really up to me, but certain frames were, and that was all I needed. One of them was, what was obviously critical at this point. We weren't going to try to, right? It cost money to try this. It was critical to see it work if it could work. So we want to give it our best shot. If we made something that could work, then after that, we could adjust it if there was some way that we were somehow violating guidelines, and we weren't obviously violating any obvious guidelines, of course. I wouldn't do something that was blatant or ridiculous. But I don't know, it just pretty clear looking at it again. I don't mean eyeballing, it literally has to be true that once you see something that's working, then you can better make adjustments without messing the conversion up. If you have the lawyer screw it first, then you'll have less clarity on what works, right? The order obviously should be tested and then so that not screw it up first and then test it. Like it's just, and the fact that the lawyer couldn't see something that to me that was obvious. I never know when my high IQ or conceptual brilliance. There's something with conceptual thinking that I am. It seems I don't know for sure. The evidence is pretty overwhelming to me as far as I can tell that I'm excellent at. There's other things that are pretty common types of intelligence that I'm not excellent at, but that I think it probably am. And so I never know when that's sneaking up on me. And I'm trying to be like generally condescending or saying that someone's not trying, thinking. It might have just been that I could do this much better than the lawyer, but even then, we still need to let him go because he's inherently asserting that he's doing a better job dictating this choice than me, and he wasn't because the law isn't relevant at that point. Doesn't so his expertise as a lawyer is irrelevant. So because it's a understanding of a different concept that explained that that's how you get over intimidation is the clarity, the detail I'm going into gave me the clarity, right? I was certain because it had nothing to do with the law. It's not even that it has to do with sales. It's a logical point that we need to see if it converts first, and then we can make adjustments as needed for FTC stuff. And then if we change something and it converts worse, we know exactly what's going on. If we reverse the order, we mess with it and it doesn't convert well. That's basically that. What are we going to do after that? Walk back changes the lawyer made, like gradually, right? You start with what you think is going to work. You don't start with the worst thing, you start with the best thing, right? So I understood that as a meta strategy. The lawyer obviously didn't. The lawyers are notoriously bad at meta strategy, and there's a reason for that. The path to become a lawyer basically doesn't reward meta strategy at pretty much any step of the way. And so they end up, if I filter for who has the longest leg, then I'm probably going to end up with a pool of people. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's not really relevant or helpful. Okay. Mike Long says, I'm so grateful to see this content here instead of Facebook. I'm agreed. Oh, Gideon's congratulating. Loves the platform as well. Terrific. This is off topic, but if you've got the time and energy, can you talk about what benefit prayer can give to us besides influencing ourselves mentally? I mean, I'll give a whack at it in a second. You guys can comment without me getting a second notification that you commented, which is that goes on front of the actual comments from Facebook. And then I sometimes misclick and I open up a whole profile. I not just those notifications. My whole Facebook account shows up. I have 4,000 people that over time have asked to be my friend, and it's not a snobbish thing. I just didn't want to mislead them and whatever, and so forth. It's some of us have email accounts that we never check. And if people write to us there, we just don't check. Keon says, can't wait to see you guys soon. Okay. So there's no other questions. Let me give a whack at the prayer thing. Besides influencing ourselves mentally, I basically don't know. Given that we don't know, and given that God exists, then, so if it's a gray area, then you pick the most useful belief. And literally, like when you understand what I'm saying, it's probably a little bit or a lot more profound than what I'm saying. The gray area is like this awesome playground where there's a real benefit to picking the best thing inside the gray area. Not even metaphysical, not prayer. This thing about the gray area picking. I don't know if it overlaps with faith. How do I explain this? Let me take a moment and I will be right back and then I will continue explaining this. I know, we've all been going for 3 hours, but I'll still give it a couple minutes and then I'll stop. But I'll be right back in a minute. Okay, I am back. Cool. More positive comments about the platform. Like, I agree. You know what else? I think I have OMG way open anyway here, which I wouldn't, but it's actually just less internet back and forth on my computer, which can potentially affect audio, right? If Facebook, this probably just is less bandwidth because Facebook has probably more stuff going on. So I don't know how good justice I'll do to this, but there's a certain truth to this. So it's plausible that prayer will impact things. Now, God can't be like arbitrary or whimsical. Like we get urges to do this or that, and we can act on them. Like we can get an urge to give money to a particular person, right? With asking for it. And we might have various heuristics, like kind of rules for doing that overall to guide our behavior. But then we also have these whims. So we're used to having whims that, and without them, we wouldn't almost know what to do. Like we kind of have a push in some direction and we decide whether to question that or think about it. And then based on thinking about it, there might be more clarity, but then we're still left with eyeballing it. Like we have a certain sense. Another way to put it is God can't like eyeball things. Nothing is gray for God, except in another way, God actually doesn't know things like things that don't exist. God doesn't see because they don't exist, like the future. God would know any patterns that would continue right in the future, anything that exists again. So if you find something that's very related to the future that exists, then God will be aware of that, but not something that doesn't. All right. So God can't be whimsical. So there would ultimately, interestingly enough, have to be certain laws of some sort. There wouldn't be laws governing electrons and protons, but they'd still be laws. They'd still be regularities. They'd still be reasons of some sort that weren't whimsical that would have to govern prayer. Because again, God's interacting with something, it can't be fully arbitrary, which, and now I don't know the object, like I don't know everything about it. I'm giving you parameters that have to be true. Things that I ask when I try to understand something are, what would it be like if it didn't exist? So let's suppose prayer had no impact, then we'd be on earth, we could seek understanding. In essence, plausible in both ways, but the I think the way, so there's another thing is Jesus is relevant for all people because, again, when you're to deal with life strategically, you're looking at impact. We can't study the biographies of every single person just in case they're critical to learn about or study. But then when we eyeball things, something's wrong with a person's eyeballing. If they eyeball people or history or whatever, and okay, either you can eyeball people that have existed now, that both exist now and have existed previously, and say it's totally irrelevant to know anything about any person who's existed previously. That doesn't make sense, right? Like the idea that there can't be any possible relevance knowing anything about anybody. So once we know that's absurd, then we would say the opposite is that it's potentially relevant to know something about some person, some biography somewhere, or of course, plenty of people, right? We might learn all kinds of various things from people that have come before us. We might absorb all kinds of wrong ideas too. And maybe someone could make a case that there's something to try to start totally from scratch and completely ignoring every person, what they've discovered, what they've said, et cetera. But as raw material, it's a little hard to imagine that making sense. And none of us ever operate that way, that every other person knowing about them, or let's say that every person who's dead or not here anymore. So Jesus is a potential exception with being dead, but maybe we would say only people that are living matter whatsoever, right? Because they're people we could joint venture with, we can sleep with, we can interact with, we can go to lunch with them, whatever. So sure, living people are relevant, but anyone who's passed away, utterly and completely irrelevant in every way. I don't want to know anything about anyone, period. Either that's the case or it's relevant. Once we say that it's relevant, that we might know something about someone who's passed away, such as what they've discovered, a vaccine they've done, periodic table that they've designed, constitution, whatever, then it becomes a matter of, since there's a lot of those such people, right? All the people that have lived and have died, then our brain is faced with our brain and therefore us are faced with the usual problem, so to speak, or the usual activity of there's too many potential data points. Just like when you're looking around visually, there's too many potential pixels and your brain has to narrow it down for you what things. Same thing with people. And yet, as we do that, Jesus is one of those figures that just, for all people anywhere that potentially could know about Jesus, he's not someone that you want to write off the list. Here you have someone who credibly fulfilled dozens, if not hundreds, of prophecies that were definitely written before Jesus. Doesn't matter who wrote the prophecy. Could have been the oracle at Delphi. It wasn't. I'm just saying, no matter who wrote the prophecies, if prophecies were written and then 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years later, they were about a person to come and then a person fulfilled them all, then that's interesting, regardless of who wrote them or who didn't write them, right? In this case, the prophecies were written by Jewish people, along with various laws that we wouldn't probably want to follow today. right? But that we can understand some validity, blah, 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 right? Various statements that are a little odd or astonishing, but yet there's all these prophecies about a particular person. Hard to tell from the prophecies that before the fact whether it was like a political messiah like Trump or whether it was going to be more like someone like Jesus. The Jews were much more expecting someone like Trump or like Winston Churchill or whatever the heck, Washington. Someone to pick Trump, not because I'm trying to praise him or not, but to fight the powers that be, right? Certainly he's doing that. So anyhow, there's all these prophecies. Then you have a person, in addition to doing all that, you have a person who, there was a person that was out in the desert saying there's going to be a person that comes and they're unbelievable. They're way better than me, right? John the Baptist. You might say, well, anyone could do that. Who? Do you have someone like in the desert with a bunch of followers eating locusts and honey and talking about how unbelievably amazing you are, right? Who have that? I have some. This was Michael Long. I have completely a joke in the sense of 0%, of course, equating or comparing myself with Jesus. Fine. Anyhow, but driving Lamborghini instead of the locusts and honey. But anyhow, and of course, not in any way, shape, or form saying that I'm anything different, a completely normal person. But in the case of John the Baptist, it was something different than that somehow. Like where he would say that the person coming after me, I'm not even fit to tie his sandals. Whether or not he said the person was God, but at least the Messiah, it's whatever. That was a little bit of a vague concept to them at the time. But someone who was just so great, so amazing, prophecy. And there was only real one entity that was prophesied. Maybe someone could argue with that, but it wasn't like there were prophecies about a whole bunch of different types of people for the most part. Just mainly this one person. And what I'm saying is just generally reasonably true for all people, right, in all time. I'm just kind of giving an overview of what's actually going on with history with Jesus, right? Saying John the Baptist existed and said Jesus is coming and he's the Messiah, he's pretty awesome, is just a historical statement. Someone could argue that history is all written false and John, whatever, doesn't, Julius Caesar doesn't exist, Abraham Lincoln didn't exist, yada. But again, we don't act that way. Right. Part of what we look at is what do we act on as and then there's a bunch of followers, there was miracles, and then Jesus made his central message that Jesus was God, which is because as far as I know, I can't think of any reasonably credible historical figure who claimed that they were God, right? The other religions aren't they're formed around prophets or very wise teachers, or at least the story is they're wise, whether or not they were or weren't. But in many cases, they said pretty awesome things. Lao Tzu, Buddha said a bunch of cool stuff. I don't really know enough about Muhammad to comment one way or the other, but there's no similarity with Jesus. They weren't claiming to be God. They're just prophets, right? The guy, former John, was John Brown, or John Smith, or someone that founded Mormonism or LDS, Latter-day Saints. None of these people, it was all like revelation. They claimed to have revelations or just wisdom, or they just said awesome things or perceived to be awesome things and people followed them. With Jesus, he claimed to be God, which is absolutely nuts and deluded unless you're God, right? So the weird thing is that nothing else in Jesus' life really matches up to being utterly deluded and ridiculous. As a matter of fact, you read what you just said, it's pretty astonishing, right? Pretty out of the box. It's not just wise in the sense of consider wisdom. It's actually a lot of it's odd and surprising. But then the more you think about it, it's well. And a lot of the objections people have to Christians and their belief that actually, if you look at it and are looking for it, they're related to Paul, about whom none of this applies. There's no prophecies, no claims to be God, no claims to infallibility, no reason to believe Paul, Apostle Paul. Paul the Apostle was, none of that. I didn't mean John, I meant Paul. But this is true about Paul. So people that worship the Apostle Paul or call them infallible, they're a lot like any other religious followers following just somebody who, the odd thing is Paul didn't even claim to have really much revelation. One time, maybe in the way to, was it Damascus or whatever? One time he claimed to have a revelation. So ignoring Paul, we're just talking about Jesus, right? People conflate the two sometimes and don't really realize that there's two different people really, and they conflate what they think Christians believe with what Jesus said. But you have a person who claimed to be God. You have a person about whom it's written that he did miracles. You have a person that then was killed, and the only plausible, logical, and historically, it's all one very coherent and logical story. Jesus was killed only for claiming he was God, period. There's nothing else that they could have under law killed him for. Even that was stretching it, but there's nothing, no other complaint they even logically really had it about him. Like a political leader, sure, but none of it was, there's a whole historical record, plus there's a lot, plus there's only the laws. It's extremely coherent, the actual story of him claiming he was God. And finally, they just couldn't find anything, and they wanted to kill him so badly during his trial. They couldn't find any way to actually find a way to do it. Pilate, I believe, or one of those people was just going to let him go. They're like, look, we can't, they're not guilty. There's not. And so they did a thing which violated their own regulations and laws big time. There's a whole bunch of ways that they violated their own rules, the Pharisees and so forth, right? The Jewish priests, but they are priest class or caste, but they are most of them, not all of them. But they finally just asked him to testify against himself and just voluntarily did and said, I am, he basically gave exact word that in their language and their culture meant, yeah, I'm claiming to be God. Right? I am the Messiah. I'm also God. And they were able to kill him for that. That gave them the excuse they needed. And there's no other plausible way that they could kill him. And then you have and then all of his, when they did that, when they killed him, all of the disciples ran away. And this is actually, again, this is related to prayer, of course, because if Jesus can be, you have to, sometimes you build foundations in a little bit of a somewhat surprising place, but Jesus made it clear that we should pray, right? Which makes it potentially relevant to the question of prayer. So really in practice, if we dismiss the idea of Jesus being foundational and we poo-poo it, then we have to find some other way to be sure about prayer. The best I can give you without referring to Jesus is the idea of the gray area thing. And you might as well act on what would make the most sense, right? Or is most useful. But once Jesus enters the picture, then Jesus very clearly prayed, spent a lot of time in prayer, encouraged us to pray, gave us an exact template, right? And so on and so forth. Not that we have to repeat that template over and over, but of course, it just gave us understanding, helped it go us understanding. So it becomes relevant, and then the details become relevant because the more you look at the details about Jesus, the more it becomes weird, very weird to dismiss Jesus. And the odd thing is that Jesus didn't leave us any room to go halfway, right? Because since he claimed to be God and made it literally his central message that he was God and was actually killed for it and couldn't have been killed for anything else, then we either say he's an utter moron, lunatic, and then we do have to dismiss. So we either have to dismiss Jesus or understand that Jesus was God or God's avatar, right? When I say God's avatar, I'm saying something very reasonable that we can understand in today's world of cyberspace. You can, in order to interact with a particular world that you don't have a body for, then you make an avatar, just like we have our profiles here, right? Or in a game, you can make a character that you can sometimes look at the character. It's not you, but it's also you, right? And it's totally reasonable to say that character's me. It's also totally reasonable to understand that it's not you in the full sense, right? So in that way, Jesus was God. And then Jesus was killed. While he was being killed, all his disciples ran away and they were demoralized because they still thought that he was going to save the Israelites who were totally oppressed by the Romans at that point. That they figured obviously the Messiah was going to free them from that and then be their king. But they'd be free except that the Messiah would be their king, right? But then they would identify with their king and feel free. That's what they thought would happen. And so they were demoralized and they gave up. Only 2 or 3 women stuck with Jesus while he was being killed, right? His mother and I think 2 others. 1 or 2 others. It depends on what. But no men. Something happened after that, several days later, and all of a sudden the men were claiming that Jesus was God, that Jesus was resurrected, and not one of those 12 people changed their story. Not one of those people would have a reason to make that story if Jesus wasn't resurrected, because where they were at was they were like, oh crap, he was wonderful, but he's gone. There's no incentive to make up that he's resurrected because they got persecuted and literally killed to death. They were all murdered for claiming that Jesus was resurrected. I believe all 11 that were left were killed for that. I believe Peter was crucified upside down. In history, we don't know exactly, or it might be very certain according to history. I don't know all the details, but either all or all but one, but none of them were canted. Either one got lucky somehow and lived to a ripe old age, but basically just not all of them or all of them were killed. And they wouldn't have been killed if they had said, oh, just kidding. If the Republican turned on Trump 2 years ago, then the media would treat them well, right? Similarly, if any one of the disciples had said, oh, no, just kidding, we made it up, then they would have been treated wonderfully. But they all died for the belief not that Jesus was a great guy, but that he was resurrected. And again, Jesus said that we should pray, presumably because it wasn't pointless, right? And when I prayed for wisdom nonstop. I need to remember to keep specifically doing that, but I prayed a lot for that over the years. I prayed for God's will to be done no matter what in my life. I don't pray for specific outcomes all that much in practice. I think it's great to do for a lot of people, just have different propensities and things. I sometimes do, and sometimes for other people I pray. Other people are a lot better about it in practice. I might get better about it. I've observed my wife pray for people and have them, I think 3 now, at least 2 cases, cancer went away. Doesn't prove that the prayer, all kinds of excuses and things. I myself don't say I know exactly what happened, but it's remarkably consistent with several other ailments that are some major where people have recovered. But in at least 2 cases, there was a cancer that was there and a tumor that was fully gone when the people went to remove it, when she prayed. That would indicate that people have various talents, almost like we have like kind of various strengths when it comes to prayer, versus that it's not just like how hard you're trying or how pious you are, or something like that. I'm not referring to that with my wife, but she's a fairly new Christian. And to think that her piosity or faith is greater than others wouldn't really make a lot of sense. What makes a lot more sense was just that people have different strengths. So even when it comes to prayer, that's also indicated, although I don't know, that might have just been something Paul was saying. But it doesn't mean that I'm not saying Paul was wrong with everything, right? Paul's worthy of potential, some respect and so forth. But anyway, okay. That is my best answer to the question about prayer. And also all these things could potentially get some sense of my process for things and how I try to work on things as I'm working on them. A little bit of an over the shoulder type of thing, a little messy, but there it goes. Michael says, is the assumption I made at 9:19 p.m. going on the right direction? Maybe I'm seeing a different timestamp than you. I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Oh, here, Mike. Here's what he said. Thank you for the additional insight. The forest versus trees was a great help. Not prove, but continue. Oh, not prove, but continue to build, or do not prove, but or I'll read this again with a little bit of paraphrasing. David, thank you for your additional insight. The forest versus trees was a great help. You are saying that you don't need to prove, but instead that you should continue to build your framework until you win. From what I'm understanding, the key where there is a time constraint is focusing on the right priority. Yes. Yeah, that is correct. As far as I understand what you're saying, that sounds exactly like what I was trying to say. It's almost like someone was trying to plan for the full win. Very cool. I'm going to miss the therapeutic effect listening to webinars has on me. And I don't mean I won't. Pretty much as long as people want to show up on webinars, I'll come around. I might come on every couple of weeks or whatever for a little while, or take a month off or something and come on. And the more attendance there is, the more frequently I'll do them. Or if I don't get to questions, I'll do another one a week later, that sort of thing. Trying to ask unanswerable questions. You'll get more. Suleiman says, how does the idea that Jesus was God pass the sledgehammer test? If something changes, it's not the same thing. Oh, just the avatar thing. It's not that great. Like in another sense, like our physical body is an avatar for our being. To say that, it's perfectly reasonable to say to someone, this is me, like I'm here. You show up to a party, you're like, hey, I'm here, we can start, right? Or they went divorced before I arrived. But that sort of thing. When I say Jesus was God, of course, Jesus wasn't like God, like Jesus's body was not God, the unchanging entity that creates everything. So again, Jesus was God's avatar body. The avatar might just, and you can see through an avatar, but the avatar doesn't see everything, right? An avatar itself can be limited in certain ways. But if God's going to have an avatar, God's not going to be telling us false things. There's going to be a perfection in certain areas, right, that God wants her to be and so forth. I'm not, by the way, asserting or changing any of the central message. When I try to say that Jesus is God's avatar, I'm not putting my own spin on things. There's some ways that I go against orthodoxy, such as with Paul the Apostle. I don't consider Paul to be infallible. I wouldn't consider the Pope to be infallible. That's just bizarre, right? Catholics do. I'm not Catholic, but if I was, it would just be a bizarre thought. I don't consider Peter or the other people that wrote in the Bible, I don't consider things to be infallible because they were later compiled into the canon, right? Jesus' brother wrote something I don't consider to be infallible. Anyway, so I don't go with orthodoxy just because it's orthodoxy. But in the case of Jesus and being God, I happen to not be saying anything out of the mainstream, just to help you interpret what I'm saying. When I say Jesus was God's avatar, I'm just the same way that Jesus said that Jesus was God's son, as part of the ways Jesus referred to himself in all kinds of different ways, because there's not a perfect way to explain an avatar, right? The Son of Man, he also said we're all sons of God in a certain way, right? But then he also clearly referred to himself in a unique way. By the way, some people say, oh, Jesus didn't say anything different than everyone else. He was trying to say we're all the same. Jesus did indicate, right? He said your body, you'll worship in spirit and your basically a body be like a temple and so forth. Certain things that apply to all of us, but Jesus also spoke in a very unique way about himself. Anyway, that's how. Of course, Jesus's body could change. Great. Perhaps your wife could pray. Yeah, I'll get a lot of requests from my wife at this point. I'll mention you, Dave. Thank you, David. Appreciate you addressing that. You're very welcome, Janine. Okay, guys, obviously I'll get time to end it given that it's been 3 hours and 19 minutes. See all of you in a couple of days. And of course, I'll be around in all kinds of wonderful ways. I will talk to you all soon. And thank you once again for your wonderful participation and showing up and all that and everything over the years, over the months, over the weeks, previous weeks. Wonderful. I know, Julie, I'm sorry you can't be there. Appreciate you being with us in spirit. Take care, all. Love the new platform. Rock and roll. We'll find great ways to use it and have it grow and have it be like a vibrant thing.